Welcome to Truth Meets Fiction, your home for timeless stories, unforgettable characters, and the kind of content that stays with you long after the credits roll. Whether it's fact, fiction, or somewhere in between, you'll find it here. Let's begin.
Shortly after, she gave birth to 3 children, and she only became conscious of what she had done when her neighbors asked after the father, that they might announce to him the arrival of the little ones. In the summer of 1845, the Greek papers contained an account of a pregnant woman murdering her husband for the purpose of roasting and eating his liver. That the passion to destroy is prevalent in certain maniacs is well known. This is sometimes accompanied by cannibalism. Gruner gives an account of a shepherd, who was evidently deranged, who killed and ate 2 men. Mark relates that a woman of Unter Alsace, during the absence of her husband, a poor laborer, murdered her son, a lad 15 months old. She chopped off his legs and stewed them with cabbage. She ate a portion and offered the rest to her husband. It is true that the family were very poor, but there was food in the house at the time. In prison the woman gave evident signs of derangement. The cases in which bloodthirstiness and cannibalism are united with insanity are those which properly fall under the head of lycanthropy. The instances recorded in the preceding chapter point unmistakably to hallucination accompanying the lust for blood. Jean Grenier, Roulet, and others were firmly convinced that they had undergone transformation. A disordered condition of mind or body may produce hallucination in a form depending on the character and instincts of the individual. Thus an ambitious man laboring under monomania will imagine himself to be a king. A covetous man will be plunged in despair, believing himself to be penniless, or exult at the vastness of the treasure which he imagines that he has discovered. The old man suffering from rheumatism or gout conceives himself to be formed of china or glass, and the fox hunter tally-hoes at each new moon as though he were following a pack. In like manner the naturally cruel man, if the least affected in his brain, will suppose himself to be transformed into the most cruel and bloodthirsty animal with which he is acquainted. The hallucinations under which lycanthropists suffered may have arisen from various causes. The older writers, as Forestus and Burton, regard the werewolf mania as a species of melancholy madness, and some do not deem it necessary for the patient to believe in his transformation for them to regard him as a lycanthropist. In the present state of medical knowledge, we know that very different conditions may rise to hallucinations. In fever cases, the sensibility is so disturbed that the patient is often deceived as to the space occupied by his limbs, and he supposes them to be preternaturally distended or contracted. In the case of typhus, it is not uncommon for the sick person with deranged nervous system to believe himself to be double in the bed, or to be severed in half, or to have lost his limbs. He may regard his members as composed of foreign and other fragile materials, as glass, or he may so lose his personality as to suppose himself to have become a woman. A monomaniac who believes himself to be someone else seeks to enter into the feelings, thoughts, and habits of the assumed personality, and from the facility with which this is effected, he draws an argument conclusive to himself of the reality of the change. He thenceforth speaks of himself under the assumed character, and experiences all its needs, wishes, passions, and the like. The closer the identification becomes, the more confirmed is the monomaniac in his madness, the character of which varies with the temperament of the individual. If the person's mind be weak or rude and uncultivated, the tenacity with which he clings to his metamorphosis is feebler, and it becomes more difficult to draw the line between his lucid and insane utterances. Thus Jean Grenier, who labored under this form of mania, said in his trial much that was true, but it was mixed with the ramblings of insanity. Hallucination may also be produced by artificial means, and there are evidences afforded by the confessions of those tried for lycanthropy that these artificial means were employed by them. I refer to the salve so frequently mentioned in witch and werewolf trials. The following passage is from the charming Golden Ass of Vaculius. It proves that salves were extensively used by witches for the purpose of transformation, even in his day. Fotis showed me a crack in the door, and bade me look through it, upon which I looked, and saw Pamphile first divest herself of all her garments, and then, having unlocked a chest, take from it several little boxes, and open one of the latter, which contained a certain ointment. Rubbing this ointment a good while previously between the palms of her hands, she anointed her whole body, from the very nails of her toes to the hair on the crown of her head, and when she was anointed all over, she whispered many magic words to a lamp, as if she were talking to it. Then she began to move her arms, first with tremulous jerks, and afterwards by a gentle undulating motion, till a glittering downy surface by degrees overspread her body. Feathers and strong quills burst forth suddenly. Her nose became a hard, crooked beak. Her toes changed to curved talons, and Pamphile was no longer Pamphile, but it was an owl I saw before me, and now, uttering a harsh, querulous scream, leaping from the ground by little and little, in order to try her powers, and presently poising herself aloft on her pinions, she stretched forth her wings on either side to their full extent, and flew straight away. Having now been actually a witness of the performance of the magical art, and of the metamorphosis of Pamphile, I remained for some time in a stupefied state of astonishment. At last, after I had rubbed my eyes some time, had recovered a little from the amazement and abstraction of mind, and begun to feel a consciousness of the reality of things about me, I took hold of the hand of Fotis, and said, "Sweet damsel, bring me, I beseech thee, a portion of the ointment with which thy mistress hath just now anointed, and when thou hast made me a bird, I will be thy slave, and even wait upon thee like a winged Cupid." Accordingly she crept gently into the apartment, quickly returned with the box of ointment, hastily placed it in my hands, and then immediately departed. Elated to an extraordinary degree at the sight of the precious treasure, I kissed the box several times successively, and uttering repeated aspirations in hopes of a prosperous flight, I stripped off my clothes as quickly as possible, dipped my fingers greedily into the box, and having thence extracted a good large lump of ointment, rubbed it all over my body and limbs. When I was thoroughly anointed, I swung my arms up and down in imitation of the movement of a bird's pinions, and continued to do so a little while, when instead of any perceptible token of feathers or wings making their appearance, my own thin skin, alas, grew into a hard leathern hide covered with bristly hair. My fingers and toes disappeared, the palms of my hands and the soles of my feet became 4 solid hoofs, and from the end of my spine a long tail projected. My face was enormous, my mouth wide, my nostrils gaping, my lips pendulous, and I had a pair of moderately long, rough, hairy ears. In short, when I came to contemplate my transformation to its full extent, I found that instead of a bird, I had become an ass. Of what these magical salves were composed we know. They were composed of narcotics, to wit, solanum somniferum, aconite, hyoscyamus, belladonna, opium, acorus vulgaris, theum. These were boiled down with oil or the fat of little children who were murdered for the purpose. The blood of a bat was added, but its effects could have been nil. To these may have been added other foreign narcotics, the names of which have not transpired. Whatever may have been the cause of the hallucination, it is not surprising that the lycanthropist should have imagined himself transformed into a beast. The cases I have instanced are those of shepherds, who were by nature of their employment brought into collision with wolves, and it is not surprising that these persons, in a condition liable to hallucinations, should imagine themselves to be transformed into wild beasts, and that their minds, reverting to the injuries sustained from these animals, they should, in their state of temporary insanity, accuse themselves of the acts of rapacity committed by the beasts into which they believe themselves to be transformed. It is a well-known fact that men, whose minds are unhinged, will deliver themselves up to justice, accusing themselves of having committed crimes which have actually taken place, and it is only on investigation that their self-accusation proves to be false, and yet they will describe the circumstances with the greatest minuteness, and be thoroughly convinced of their own criminality. I need give but a single instance. In the war of the French Revolution, the Hermione frigate, was commanded by Captain Pigot, a harsh man and a severe commander. His crew mutinied and carried the ship into an enemy's port, having murdered the captain and several of the officers, under circumstances of extreme barbarity. One midshipman escaped, by whom many of the criminals, who were afterwards taken and delivered over to justice, one by one, were identified. Mr. Finlayson, the government actuary, who at that time held an official situation in the Admiralty, states, "In my own experience I have known, on separate occasions, more than 6 sailors who voluntarily confessed to having struck the first blow at Captain Pigot. These men detailed all the horrid circumstances of the mutiny with extreme minuteness and perfect accuracy. Nevertheless, not one of them had ever been in the ship, nor had so much as seen Captain Pigot in their lives. They had obtained by tradition, from their messmates, the particulars of the story. When long on a foreign station, hungering and thirsting for home, their minds became enfeebled. At length they actually believed themselves guilty of the crime over which they had so long brooded, and submitted with a gloomy pleasure to being sent to England in irons for judgment. At the Admiralty we were always able to detect and establish their innocence in defiance of their own solemn asseverations." London Judicial Gazette, January 1808. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10 of the Book of Werewolves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Amy Graymore. The Book of Werewolves by Sabine Baring-Gould. Chapter 10, Mythological Origin of the Werewolf Myth. Metempsychosis. Sympathy between men and beasts. Finnbog and the bear. Osage and the beaver. The connection of soul and body. Buddhism. Case of Mr. Holloway. Popular ideas concerning the body. The derivation of the German Lycanthropy. Feather dresses. Transmigration of souls. A Basque story. Story from the Panchatantra. Savage ideas regarding natural phenomena. Thunder, lightning, and cloud. The origin of the dragon. John of Brompton's dragon, a waterspout. The legend of Tophus. Allegorizing of the effects of a hurricane. Anthropomorphos. The cirrus cloud, a heavenly swan. Urvasi. The storm cloud, a demon. Varitra and Rakshasas. Story of a Brahmin and a Rakshasas. Transformation into beasts forms an integral portion of all mythological systems. The gods of Greece were wont to change themselves into animals in order to carry out their designs with greater speed, security, and secrecy than in human forms. In Scandinavian mythology, Odin changed himself into the shape of an eagle, Loki into that of a salmon. Eastern religions abound in stories of transformation. The line of demarcation between this and the translation of a beast's soul into man, or a man's soul into a beast's, metempsychosis, is very narrow. The doctrine of metempsychosis is found on the consciousness of gradation between beasts and men. The belief in a soul-endowed animal world was present among the ancients, and the laws of intelligence and instinct were misconstrued, or were regarded as a puzzle which no man might solve. The human soul, with its consciousness, seems to be something already perfected in a pre-existing state, and in the myth of metempsychosis we trace the yearnings and gropings of the soul after the source whence its own consciousness was derived, counting its dreams and hallucinations as gleams of memory, recording acts which had taken place in a former state of existence. Modern philosophy has resumed the same thread of conjecture, and thinks to see in man the perfected development of lower organisms. After death, the translation of the soul was supposed to continue. It became either absorbed into the nous, into Brahma, into the deity, or it sank in the scale of creation and was degraded to animate a brute. Thus the doctrine of metempsychosis was emphatically one of rewards and punishments, for the condition of the soul after death depended on its training during life. A savage and bloodthirsty man was exiled, as in the case of Lycaon, into the body of a wild beast. The soul of a timorous man entered a hare, and drunkards or gluttons became swine. The intelligence which was manifest in the beasts bore such a close resemblance to that of man, in the childhood and youth of the world, that it is not to be wondered at if our forefathers failed to detect the line of demarcation drawn between instinct and reason, and failing to distinguish this, they naturally fell into the belief in metempsychosis. It was not merely a fancied external resemblance between the beast and man, but it was the perception of skill, pursuits, desires, sufferings, and griefs like his own in the animal creation, which led man to detect within the beast something analogous to the soul within himself, and this, notwithstanding the points of contrast existing between them, elicited in his mind so strong a sympathy that, without a great stretch of imagination, he invested the beast with his own attributes, and with the full powers of his own understanding. He regarded it as actuated by the same motives, as subject to the same laws of honor, as moved by the same prejudices, and the higher the beast was in the scale, the more he regarded it as an equal. A singular illustration of this will be found in the Finnboga Saga, chapter 11. Now we must relate about Finnbog. Afterward in the evening, when men slept, he rose, took his weapons, and went forth, following the tracks which led to the dairy farm. As he was wont, he stepped out briskly along the spoor till he came to the dairy. There he found the bear lying down, and he had slain the sheep, and he was lying on them, lapping their blood. Then said Finnbog, "Stand up, Bruin, make ready against me. That becomes you more than crouching over those sheep's carcasses." The bear sat up, looked at him, and lay down again. Finnbog said, "If you think I am too fully armed to match with you, I will do this." And he took off his helmet and laid aside his shield. Then he said, "Stand up now, if you dare." The bear sat up, shook his head, and then cast himself down again. Finnbog exclaimed, "I see you want us both to be born alike." So he flung aside his sword and said, "Be it as you will. Now stand up, if you have the heart that I believe you have, rather than one such as was possessed by these rent sheep." Then Bruin stood up and prepared to fight. The following story, taken from the mouth of an Osage Indian by J.A. Jones, and published in his Traditions of the North American Indians, shows how thoroughly the savage mind misses the line of demarcation between instinct and reason, and how the man of the woods looks upon beasts as standing on an equality with himself. An Osage warrior is in search of a wife. He admires the tidy and shrewd habits of the beaver. He accordingly goes to a beaver hut to obtain one of that race for a bride. In one corner of the room sat a beaver woman, combing the heads of some little beavers, whose ears she boxed very soundly when they would not lie still. The warrior, i.e. the beaver chief, whispered the Osage that she was his second wife, and was very apt to be cross when there was work to be done, which prevented her from going to see her neighbors. Those whose heads she was combing were her children, he said, and she, who had made them rub their noses against each other and be friends, was his eldest daughter. Then calling aloud, "Wife," said he, "what have you to eat? The stranger is undoubtedly hungry. See, he is pale, his eye has no fire, and his step is like that of a moose." Without replying to him, for it was a sulky day with her, she called aloud, and a dirty-looking beaver entered. "Go," said she, "and fetch the stranger something to eat." With that the beaver girl passed through a small door into another room, from which she soon returned, bringing some large pieces of willow bark, which she laid at the feet of the warrior and his guest. While the warrior beaver was chewing the willow, and the Osage was pretending to do so, they fell to talking over many matters, particularly the wars of the beavers with the otters, and their frequent victories over them. He told our father by what means the beavers felled large trees, and moved them to the places where they wished to make dams, how they raised to an erect position the poles for their lodges, and how they plastered them so as to keep out rain. Then he spoke of their employments when they had buried the hatchet, of the peace and happiness and tranquillity they enjoyed when gathered into companies. They rested from their labors, and passed their time in talking and feasting and bathing and playing the game of bones and making love. All the while the young beaver maiden sat with her eyes fixed upon the Osage, at every pause moving a little nearer, till at length she was at his side, with her fore paw upon his arm. A minute more, and she had placed it around his neck, and was rubbing her soft furry cheek against his. Our ancestor, on his part, betrayed no disinclination to receive her caresses, but returned them with equal ardor. The old beaver, seeing what was going on, turned his back upon them, and suffered them to be as kind to each other as they pleased. At last, turning quickly round, while the maiden, suspecting what was coming, and pretending to be abashed, ran behind her mother, he said, "To end this foolery, what say you to marrying my daughter? She is well brought up, and is the most industrious girl in the village. She will flap more wall with her tail in a day than any maiden in the nation. She will gnaw down a large tree betwixt the rising of the sun and the coming of the shadows than many a smart beaver of the other sex. As for her wit, try her at the game of the dish, and see who gets up master. And for cleanliness, look at her petticoat." Our father answered that he did not doubt that she was industrious and cleanly, able to gnaw down a very large tree, and to use her tail to very good purpose, that he loved her much, and wished to make her the mother of his children, and thereupon the bargain was concluded. These two stories, the one taken from Icelandic saga, the other from American Indian tradition, show clearly the oneness which the uncultivated mind believes to exist between the soul of man and the soul of beast. The same sentiments actuate both man and brute, and if their actions are unlike, it is because of the difference in their formation. The soul within is identical, but the external accidents of body are unlike. Among many rude as well as cultivated people, the body is regarded as a mere garment wrapped around the soul. The Buddhist looks upon identity as existing in the soul alone, and the body as no more constituting identity than the clothes he puts on or takes off. He exists as a spirit. For convenience he vests himself in a body. Sometimes that body is human, sometimes it is bestial. As his soul rises in the spiritual scale, the nobler is the animal form which it tenants. Buddha himself passed through various stages of existence. In one he was a hare, and his soul, being noble, led him to immolate himself in order that he might offer hospitality to Indra, who in the form of an old man craved of him food and shelter. The Buddhist regards animals with reverence. An ancestor may be tenanting the body of the ox he is driving, or a descendant may be running at his side barking and wagging his tail. When he falls into an ecstasy, the soul is leaving his body for a little while. It is laying aside its raiment of flesh and blood and bone to return to it once more when the trance is over. But this idea is not confined to Buddhists. It is common everywhere. The spirit or soul is supposed to be imprisoned in the body. The body is but the lantern through which the spirit shines. The corruptible body is believed to press down the soul, and the soul is unable to attain to perfect happiness till it has shuffled off this earthly coil. Butler regards the members of the body as so many instruments used by the soul for the purpose of seeing, hearing, feeling, etc., just as we use telescopes or crutches, and which may be rejected without injury to our individuality. The late Mr. J. Holloway, of the Bank of England, brother to the engraver of that name, related of himself that, being one night in bed and unable to sleep, he had fixed his eyes and thoughts with uncommon intensity on a beautiful star that was shining in at the window, when he suddenly found his spirit released from his body and soaring into space, but instantly seized with anxiety for the anguish of his wife if she discovered his body apparently dead beside her. He returned and re-entered it with difficulty. He described that returning as a returning from light into darkness, and that whilst the spirit was free, he was alternately in the light or the dark, according as his thoughts were with his wife or with the star. Popular mythology in most lands regards the soul as oppressed by the body, and its liberation is considered a deliverance from the burden of the flesh. Whether the soul is at all able to act or express itself without a body, any more than a fire is able to make cloth without the apparatus of boiler and machinery, is a question which has not commended itself to the popular mind. But it may be remarked that the Christian religion alone is that which raises the body to a dignity equal to that of the soul, and gives it a hope of ennoblement and resurrection never dreamed of in any mythological system. But the popular creed, in spite of the most emphatic testimony of Scripture, is that the soul is in bondage as long as it is united to a body, a creed entirely in accordance with that of Buddhism. If the body be but the cage, as a poet of our own, Vaughan, Silex Scintillans, has been pleased to call it, in which dwells the imprisoned soul, it is quite possible for the soul to change its cage, if the body be but a vesture clothing the soul, as the Buddhist asserts. It is not improbable that it may occasionally change its vesture. This is self-evident, and thus has arisen the countless tales of transformation and transmigration which are found all over the world. That the same view of the body as a mere clothing of the soul was taken by our Teutonic and Scandinavian ancestors is evident even from the etymology of the words Lycanam, Likama, used to express the soulless body. I have already spoken of the Norse word hammer. I wish now to make some further remarks upon it. Hammer is represented in Anglo-Saxon by Hama, Homa, in Saxon by Hamo, in Old High German by Hamo, in Old French by Homa, Hama, to which are related the Gothic Gahamon, Ufarhamon, Anahamon, Injuistai, Epenjuistai, Anthamon, Afhamon, Epektian, Ekduistai. Thence also the High German Hamidi, and the modern Hemdi, garment. In composition we find this word as Lickhammer in Old Norse, in Old High German Lickamo, Anglo-Saxon Lickhammer, and Flosskamo, Old Saxon Lickamo, modern German Leichnam, a body, i.e. a garment of flesh, precisely as the bodies of birds are called in Old Norse Jorhammer, in Anglo-Saxon Feverhoma, in Old Saxon Featherhammer, or feather dresses, and the bodies of wolves are called in Old Norse Ulfshammer, and seals' bodies in Feros Kopahammer. The significance of the old verb ayuhamas is now evident. It is to migrate from one body to another, and hamaskipti is a transmigration of the soul. The method of this transmigration consists in simply investing the body with the skin of the animal into which the soul was to migrate. When Loki, the northern god of evil, went in quest of the stolen Idun, he borrowed of Freya her falcon dress, and at once became, to all intents and purposes, a falcon. Thiassi pursued him, as he left Thrymhammer, having first taken upon him an eagle's dress, and thereby become an eagle. In order to seek Thor's lost hammer, Loki borrowed again of Freya her feather dress, and as he flew away in it, the feathers sounded, as they winnowed the breeze, Fjörhammer Donjor. In like manner, Kaidon speaks of an evil spirit flying away in feather dress. Hjert he mid Fjörhamn, fliegen mihat, winden on wolkni, and of an angel, pure par swigen quam, engelpest loden obama fun, regerfaren und Fjörhamn. The very expression made use of when speaking of a bird, Farad und Fjörhamn. The soul in certain cases is able to free itself from the body and to enter that of beast or man. In this form stood the myth in various theological systems. Among the Finns and Lapps, it is not uncommon for a magician to fall into a cataleptic condition, and during the period his soul is believed to travel very frequently in bodily form, having assumed that of any animal most suitable for its purpose. I have given instances in a former chapter. The same doctrine is evident in most cases of lycanthropy. The patient is in a state of trance, his body is watched, and it remains motionless, but his soul has migrated into the carcass of a wolf, which it vivifies, and in which it runs its course. A curious Basque story shows that among the strange Turanian people, cut off by such a flood of Aryan nations from any other members of its family, the same superstition remains. A huntsman was once engaged in the chase of a bear among the Pyrenean peaks, when Bruin turned suddenly on him and hugged him to death, but not before he had dealt the brute its mortal wound. As the huntsman expired, he breathed his soul into the body of the bear, and thenceforward ranged the mountains as a beast. One of the tales of the Sanskrit Book of Fables, the Panchatantra, affords such a remarkable testimony to the Indian belief in metempsychosis that I am tempted to give it in abstract. A king was one day passing through the marketplace of his city, when he observed a hunchbacked Merry Andrew, whose contortions and jokes kept the bystander in a roar of laughter. Amused with the fellow, the king brought him to his palace. Shortly after, in the hearing of the clown, a necromancer taught the monarch the art of sending his soul into a body not his own. Some little while after this, the monarch, anxious to put in practice his newly acquired knowledge, rode into the forest accompanied by the fool, who he believed had not heard, or at all events comprehended, the lesson. They came upon the corpse of a Brahmin lying in the depth of the jungle, where he had died of thirst. The king, leaving his horse, performed the requisite ceremony, and instantly his soul had migrated into the body of the Brahmin, and his own lay as dead upon the ground. At the same moment, however, the hunchback deserted his body, and possessed himself of that which had been the king's, and shouting farewell to the dismayed monarch, he rode back to the palace, where he was received with royal honors. But it was not long before the queen and one of the ministers discovered that a screw was somewhere loose, and when the quondam king, but now Brahmin, arrived and told his tale, a plot was laid for the recovery of his body. The queen asked her false husband whether it were possible to make her parrot talk, and he, in a moment of uxorious weakness, promised to make it speak. He laid his body aside and sent his soul into the parrot. Immediately the true king jumped out of his Brahmin body and resumed that which was legitimately his own, and then proceeded, with the queen, to wring the neck of the parrot. But besides the doctrine of metempsychosis, which proved such a fertile mother of fable, there was another article of popular mythology which gave rise to stories of transformation. Among the abundant superstitions existing relative to transformation, 3 shapes seem to have been preeminently affected: that of the swan, that of the wolf, and that of the serpent. In many of the stories of those transformed, it is evident that the individual who changes shape is regarded with superstitious reverence as a being of a higher order, of a divine nature. In Christian countries, everything relating to heathen mythology was regarded with a suspicious eye by the clergy, and any miraculous powers not sanctioned by the Church were attributed to the evil one. The heathen gods became devils, and the marvels related of them were supposed to be effected by diabolic agency. The case of transformation, which had shown the power of an ancient god, was in Christian times considered as an instance of witchcraft. Thus stories of transformation fell into bad odor, and those who changed shapes were no longer regarded as heavenly beings commanding reverence, but as miserable witches deserving the stake. In the infancy of the world, when natural phenomena were ill understood, expressions which to us are poetical were of a real significance. When we speak of thunder rolling, we use an expression which conveys no further idea than a certain likeness observed between the detonations and the roll of a vehicle. But to the uninstructed mind it was more. The primeval savage knew not what caused thunder, and tracing the resemblance between it and the sound of wheels, he at once concluded that the chariots of the gods were going abroad, or that the celestial spirits were enjoying a game of bowls. We speak of fleecy clouds, because they appear to us soft and light as wool, but the first men, tracing the same resemblance, believed the light vapors to be flocks of heavenly sheep. Or we may say that clouds are flying. The savage used the same expression as he looked up at the mackerel sky, and saw in it flights of swans coursing over the heavenly lake. Once more we creep nearer to the winter fire, shivering at the wind, which we remark is howling around the house, and yet we do not suppose that the wind has a voice. The wild primeval men thought that it had, and because dogs and wolves howl, and the wind howled, because they had seen dogs and wolves, they concluded that the storm wind was a night-bound, or a monstrous wolf, racing over the country in the darkness of the winter night, ravening for prey. Along with the rise of this system of explaining the operations of nature by analogies in the bestial world, another conclusion forced itself on the untaught mind. The flocks which strayed in heaven were no earthly sheep, but were the property of spiritual beings, and were themselves perhaps spiritual. The swans which flew aloft, far above the topmost peak of the Himalaya, were no ordinary swans, but were divine and heavenly. The wolf which howled so wildly in the long winter night, the hounds whose bay sounded so dismally through the shaking black forest, were no mundane wolves and hounds, but issued from the home of the divine hunter, and were themselves wondrous supernatural beings of godlike race. And so the clouds having become swans, the swan clouds were next believed to be divine beings, Valkyries, Apsaras, and the like, seen by mortals in their feather dresses, but appearing among the gods as damsels. The storm wind having been supposed to be a wolf, next was taken to be a tempestuous god who delighted to hunt on earth in lupine form. I have mentioned also the serpent shape as being one very favorite in mythology. The ancient people saw the forked and writhing lightning, and supposed it to be a heavenly fiery serpent, a serpent which had godlike powers, which was in fact a divine being, manifesting himself to mortals under that form. Among the North American Indians, the lightning is still regarded as the great serpent, and the thunder is supposed to be his hissing. "Ah!" exclaimed a Magdeburg peasant to a German professor during a thunderstorm, as a vivid forked gleam shot to the earth, "what a glorious snake was that!" And this resemblance did not escape the Greeks. Helices, decompusis terapes, sapidoi, Aeschylus, Prometheus Bound, 1064. Dracuta, personoton, hos apleton ampelictos, helicapruse ketanon, Euripides Heracles, f. 395. And according to Aristotle, helikiai are the lightnings, gramoe dos, heromenoi. It is so difficult for us to unlearn all we know of the nature of meteorological phenomena, so hard for us to look upon atmospheric changes as though we knew nothing of the laws that govern them, that we are disposed to treat such explanations of popular myths as I have given above as fantastic and improbable. But among the ancients all solutions of natural problems were tentative, and it is only after the failure of every attempt made to explain these phenomena on supernatural grounds that we have been driven to the discovery of the true interpretation. Yet among the vulgar a vast amount of mythology remains, and is used still to explain atmospheric mysteries. The other day, a Yorkshire girl, when asked why she was not afraid of thunder, replied because it was only her father's voice. What knew she of the rushing together of air to fill the vacuum caused by the transit of the electric fluid? To her the thunderclap was the utterance of the Almighty. Still in North Germany does the peasant say of thunder that the angels are playing skittles aloft, and of the snow that they are shaking up the feather beds in heaven. The myth of the dragon is one which admits, perhaps more than any other, of identification with a meteorological phenomenon, and presents to us as well the phase of transition from theriomorphous to anthropomorphous. The dragon of popular mythology is nothing else than the thunderstorm, rising at the horizon, rushing with expanded, winnowing black pennons across the sky, darting out its forked fiery tongue and belching fire. In a Slovakian legend, the dragon sleeps in a mountain cave through the winter months, but at the equinox bursts forth, and in a moment the heaven was darkened and became black as pitch, only illumined by the fire which flashed from the dragon's jaws and eyes. The earth shuddered, the stones rattled down the mountainsides into the glens. Right and left and right, did the dragon lash his tail, overthrowing pines and beeches, snapping them as rods. He evacuated such floods of water that the mountain torrents were full. But after a while his power was exhausted. He lashed no more with his tail, ejected no more water, and spat no more fire. I think it is impossible not to see in this description a springtide thunderstorm, but to make it more evident that the untaught mind did regard such a storm as a dragon, I think the following quotation from John of Brompton's Chronicle will convince the most skeptical. Another remarkable thing is this, that took place during a certain month in the Gulf of Satalia, on the coast of Pamphylia. There appeared a great and black dragon, which came in clouds, and let down his head into the water, whilst his tail seemed turned to the sky, and the dragon drew the water to him by drinking, with such avidity, that if any ship, even though laden with men or any other heavy articles, had been near him when drinking, it would nevertheless have been sucked up and carried on high. In order, however, to avoid this danger, it is necessary, when people see it, at once to make a great uproar, and to shout and hammer tables, so that the dragon, hearing the noise, and the voices of those shouting, may withdraw himself far off. Some people, however, assert that this is not a dragon, but the sun drawing up the waters of the sea, which seems more probable. Such is John of Brompton's account of a waterspout. In Greek mythology, the dragon of the storm has begun to undergo anthropomorphosis. Typhos is the son of Tartarus and Terra. The storm rising from the horizon may well be supposed to issue from the earth's womb, and its characteristics are sufficient to decide its paternity. Typhus, the whirlwind or typhoon, has 100 dragon or serpent heads, the long writhing striae of vapor which runs before the hurricane cloud. He belches fire, that is, lightnings issue from the clouds, and his roaring is like the howling of wild dogs. Typhus ascends to heaven to make war on the gods, who fly from him in various fantastic shapes. Who cannot see in this ascent the hurricane climbing up the vault of sky, and in the flying gods the many fleeting fragments of white cloud which are seen drifting across the heavens before the gale. Typhus, according to Hesiod, is the father of all bad winds, which destroy with rain and tempest, all, in fact, which went among the Greeks by the name of Lailaipes, bringing injury to the agriculturist and peril to the voyager. Ecditi poios, heromenoi, hygron aipton, nospi notu boreote, kai argestio supirute, huigmin inintopin, gine tonetois megonear, haidalai, mepsaurai, epipneusi, talasan, haidetoi, piptusai, et erwe dia ponton, pima mega tonetoiasi kaker tiusin aele, alote delai aesi, dias kidnasi, teneas, nautas, tipteusi, kakudu gegnetai alke, andrasin, vokenisi, sinon tontai kata ponton, ai daukai, kata geon apediton, antemoyasan, gereta ptedusi, kamai geneon anthropon, pimpleusai, konios te, kai agaleu, kolosirtu. Hesiod, Theogony, 870. In both Greek and Lithuanian household mythology, the dragon or drake has become an ogre, a gigantic man with few of the draconian attributes remaining. Von Hahn, in his Griechik und Albanesic Märchen, tells many tales of drakes, and in all the old characteristics have been lost, and the drake is simply a gigantic man with magical and superhuman powers. It is the same among the Lithuanian peasantry. A dragon walks on 2 legs, talks, flirts with a lady, and marries her. He retains his evil disposition, but has sloughed off his scales and wings. Such is the change which has taken place in the popular conception of the dragon, which is the impersonification of the thunderstorm. A similar change has taken place in the swan maiden and werewolf myths. In ancient Indian Vedaic mythology, the Apsaras were heavenly damsels who dwelt in the ether between earth and sun. Their name, which signifies the shapeless or those who go in the water, it is uncertain which is the correct derivation, is expressive of the white cirrus, constantly changing form and apparently floating swan-like on the blue heaven sea. These Apsaras, according to the Vedaic creed, were fond of changing their shapes, appearing generally as ducks or swans, occasionally as human beings. The souls of heroes were given to them for lovers and husbands. One of the most graceful of the early Indian myths is the story of the Apsaras, Urvasi. Urvasi loved Puravaras and became his wife, on the condition that she was never to behold him in a state of nudity. They remained together for years, till the heavenly companions of Urvasi determined to secure her return to them. They accordingly beguiled Puravaras into leaving his bed in the darkness of night, and then with a lightning flash they disclosed him in his nudity to his wife, who was thereupon constrained to leave him. He pursued her, full of sorrow at his loss, and found her at length swimming in a large lotus pond, in swan's shape. That this story is not a mere invention, but rests on some mythological explanation of natural phenomena, I think more than probable, as it is found all over the world with few variations. As every Aryan branch retains the story, or traces of it, there can be no doubt that the belief in swan maidens who swam in the heavenly sea, and who sometimes became the wives of those fortunate men who managed to steal from them their feather dresses, formed an integral portion of the old mythological system of the Aryan family before it was broken up into Indian, Persian, Greek, Latin, Russian, Scandinavian, Teutonic, and other races, but more as the same myth is found in tribes not Aryan and far removed from contact with European or Indian superstition, as for instance among Samoyeds and American Indians. It is even possible that this story may be a tradition of the first primeval stock of men. But it is time for me to leave the summer cirrus and turn to the tempest-born rain cloud. It is represented in ancient Indian mythology by the Vritra, or Rakshasas. At first the form of these demons was uncertain and obscure. Vritra is often used as an appellative for a cloud, and Kabhanda, an old name for a rain cloud, in later times became the name of a devil. Of Vritra, who envelops the mountain with vapor, it is said, the darkness stood, retaining the water, the mountains lay in the belly of Vritra. By degrees, Vritra stood out more prominently as a demon, and he is described as a devourer of gigantic proportions. In the same way, Rakshasas obtained corporeal form and individuality. He is a misshapen giant, like to a cloud, with a red beard and red hair, with pointed, protruding teeth, ready to lacerate and devour human flesh. His body is covered with coarse, bristling hair. His huge mouth is open. He looks from side to side as he walks, lusting after the flesh and blood of men, to satisfy his raging hunger and quench his consuming thirst. Towards nightfall, his strength increases manifold. He can change his shape at will. He haunts the woods and roams howling through the jungle. In short, he is to the Hindu what the werewolf is to the European. A certain wood was haunted by Rakshasa. He one day came across a Brahmin, and with a bound reached his shoulders and clung to him, exclaiming, "Hey, go on with you!" And the Brahmin, quaking with fear, advanced with him. But when he observed that the feet of the Rakshasas were as delicate as the stamens of the lotus, he asked him, "How is it that you have such weak and slender feet?" The Rakshasa replied, "I never walk nor touch the earth with my feet. I have made a vow not to do so." Presently they came to a large pond. Then the Rakshasa bade the Brahmin wait at the edge whilst he bathed and prayed to the gods. But the Brahmin thought, "As soon as these prayers and ablutions are over, he will tear me to pieces with his fangs and eat me. He has vowed not to walk. I will be off post haste." So he ran away, and the Rakshasa dared not follow him for fear of breaking his vow. Panchatantra, Volume 13. There is a similar story in the Mahabharata 13, and in the Katha Sagara, Volume 49 through 53. I have said sufficient to show that natural phenomena gave rise to mythological stories, and that these stories have gradually deteriorated and have degraded into vulgar superstitions. And I have shown that both the doctrine of metempsychosis and the mythological explanations of meteorological changes have given rise to abundant fable, and among others to the popular and widespread superstition of lycanthropy. I shall now pass from myth to history, and shall give instances of bloodthirstiness, cruelty, and cannibalism. End of Chapter 10.
Chapter 11 of the Book of Werewolves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. The Book of Werewolves by Sabine Baring-Gould. Chapter 11. The Maréchal de Rais. 1. The Investigation of Charges. Introduction. History of Gilles de Laval. The Castle of Machecoul. Surrender of the Marshal. Examination of witnesses. Letter of de Rais. the Duke of Brittany's reluctance to move. The Bishop of Nantes. The history of the man whose name heads this chapter I purpose giving in detail, as the circumstances I shall narrate have, I believe, never before been given with accuracy to the English public. The name of Gilles de Laval may be well known, as sketches of his bloody career have appeared in many biographies, but these sketches have been very incomplete, as the material from which they were composed was meagre. Monsieur Michelet alone ventured to give the public an idea of the crimes which brought a Marshal of France to the gallows, and his revelations were such that, in the words of Monsieur Henri Martin, this Iron Age, which seemed unable to feel surprise at any amount of evil, was struck with dismay. Monsieur Michelet derived his information from the abstract of the papers relating to the case, made by order of Anne of Brittany in the Imperial Library. The original documents were in the library at Nantes, and a great portion of them were destroyed in the Revolution of 1789. But a careful analysis had been made of them, and this valuable abridgment, which was inaccessible to Monsieur Michelet, came into the hands of Monsieur Lacroix, the eminent French antiquarian, who published a memoir of the Marshal from the information he had thus obtained, and it is his work, by far the most complete and circumstantial which has appeared, that I condense into the following chapters. The most monstrously depraved imagination, says Monsieur Henri Martin, never could have conceived what the trial reveals. Monsieur Lacroix has been obliged to draw a veil over much that transpired, and I must draw it closer still. I have, however, said enough to show that this memorable trial presents horrors probably unsurpassed in the whole volume of the world's history. During the year 1440, a terrible rumour spread through Brittany, and especially through the ancient Pays de Ré, which extends along the south of the Loire from Nantes to Paimboeuf, to the effect that one of the most famous and powerful noblemen in Brittany, Gilles de Laval, Maréchal de Ré, was guilty of crimes of the most diabolical nature. Gilles de Laval, eldest son of Guy de Laval, second of his name, Sire de Ré, had raised the junior branch of the illustrious house of Laval above the elder branch, which was related to the reigning family of Brittany. He lost his father when he was aged 20, and remained master of a vast territorial inheritance, which was increased by his marriage with Catherine de Thouars in 1420. He employed a portion of their fortune in the cause of Charles VII, and in strengthening the French crown. During 7 consecutive years, from 1426 to 1433, he was engaged in military enterprises against the English. His name is always cited, along with those of Dunois, Saint-Troul, Florent d'Illiers, Gaucourt, Richemont, and the most faithful servants of the king. His services were speedily acknowledged by the king, creating him Marshal of France. In 1427, he assaulted the castle of Lude, and carried it by storm. He killed with his own hand the commander of the place. Next year he captured from the English the fortress of Renfort, and the castle of Malicorne. In 1429, he took an active part in the expedition of Joan of Arc for the deliverance of Orleans and the occupation of Jargeau, and he was with her in the moat when she was wounded by an arrow under the walls of Paris. The marshal, councillor, and chamberlain of the king participated in the direction of public affairs, and soon obtained the entire confidence of his master. He accompanied Charles to Rheims on the occasion of his coronation, and had the honour of bearing the oriflamme, brought for the occasion from the Abbey of Saint-Remy. His intrepidity on the field of battle was as remarkable as his sagacity in council, and he proved himself to be both an excellent warrior and a shrewd politician. Suddenly, to the surprise of everyone, he quitted the service of Charles VII, and sheathed forever his sword in the retirement of the country. The death of his maternal grandfather, Jean de Caron, in 1432, made him so enormously wealthy that his revenues were estimated at 300,000 livres. Nevertheless, in 2 years, by his excessive prodigality, he managed to lose a considerable portion of his inheritance. Maurion, Saint-Étienne de Malemort, Loroux-Botereau, Porny, and Chantolet he sold to Jean V, Duke of Brittany, his kinsman, and other lands and seigneurial rights he ceded to the Bishop of Nantes and to the chapter of the cathedral in that city. The rumour soon spread that these extensive cessions of territory were sops thrown to the Duke and to the Bishop, to restrain the one from confiscating his goods and the other from pronouncing excommunication, for the crimes of which the people whisperingly accused him. But these rumours were probably without foundation, for eventually it was found hard to persuade the Duke of the guilt of his kinsman, and the Bishop was the most determined instigator of the trial. The Marshal seldom visited the ducal court, but he often appeared in the city of Nantes, where he inhabited the Hôtel de la Suze with a princely retinue. He had always accompanying him a guard of 200 men-at-arms and a numerous suite of pages, esquires, chaplains, singers, astrologers, etc., all of whom he paid handsomely. Whenever he left the town or moved to one of his other seats, the cries of the poor, which had been restrained during the time of his presence, broke forth. Tears flowed, curses were uttered, a long-continued wail rose to heaven the moment the last of the Marshal's party had left the neighbourhood. Mothers had lost their children, babes had been snatched from the cradle, infants had been spirited away almost from the maternal arms, and it was known by sad experience that the vanished little ones would never be seen again. But on no part of the country did the shadow of this great fear fall so deeply as on the villages in the neighbourhood of the castle of Machecoul, a gloomy chateau, composed of huge towers and surrounded by deep moats, a residence much frequented by De Retz, notwithstanding its sombre and repulsive appearance. This fortress was always in a condition to resist the siege. The drawbridge was raised, the portcullis down, the gates closed, the men under arms, the culverins on the bastion always loaded. No one except the servants had penetrated into this mysterious asylum and had come forth alive. In the surrounding country, strange tales of horror and devilry circulated in whispers, and yet it was observed that the chapel of the castle was gorgeously decked with tapestries of silk and cloth of gold, that the sacred vessels were encrusted with gems, that the vestments of the priests were of the most sumptuous character. The excessive devotion of the Marshal was also noticed. He was said to hear Mass thrice daily, and to be passionately fond of ecclesiastical music. He was said to have asked permission of the Pope that a crucifer should precede him in processions. But when dusk settled down over the forest, and one by one the windows of the castle became illumined, peasants would point to one casement high up in an isolated tower, from which a clear light streamed through the gloom of night. They spoke of a fierce red glare which irradiated the chamber at times, and of sharp cries ringing out of it, through the hushed woods, to be answered only by the howl of the wolf as it rose from its lair to begin its nocturnal rambles. On certain days, at fixed hours, the drawbridge sank, and the servants of De Retz stood in the gateway distributing clothes, money, and food to the mendicants who crowded round them soliciting alms. It often happened that children were among the beggars. As often one of the servants would promise them some dainty if they would go to the kitchen for it. Those children who accepted the offer were never seen again. In 1440, the long pent-up exasperation of the people broke all bounds, and with one voice they charged the Marshal with the murder of their children, whom they said he had sacrificed to the devil. This charge came to the ears of the Duke of Brittany, but he pooh-poohed it, and would have taken no steps to investigate the truth, had not one of his nobles insisted on his doing so. At the same time, Jean de Chateauguyon, Bishop of Nantes, and the noble and sage Pierre de l'Hôpital, Grand Seneschal of Brittany, wrote to the Duke, expressing very decidedly their views that the charge demanded thorough investigation. Jean Quinze, reluctant to move against a relation, a man who had served his country so well and was in such a high position, at last yielded to their request, and authorized them to seize the persons of the Sire de Retz and his accomplices. A sergeant d'armes, Jean l'Abbé, was charged with this difficult commission. He picked a band of resolute fellows, 20 in all, and in the middle of September they presented themselves at the gate of the castle, and summoned the Sire de Retz to surrender. As soon as Gilles heard that a troop in the livery of Brittany was at the gate, he inquired Who was their leader? On receiving the answer, l'Abbé, he started, turned pale, crossed himself, and prepared to surrender, observing that it was impossible to resist fate. Years before, one of his astrologers had assured him that he would one day pass into the hands of an abbé, and, till this moment, de Rais had supposed that the prophecy signified that he should eventually become a monk. Gilles de Sillé, Roger de Briqueville, and other of the accomplices of the Marshal took to flight, but Henriet and Pontou remained with him. The drawbridge was lowered, and the Marshal offered his sword to Jean l'Abbé. The gallant sergeant approached, kneeled to the Marshal, and unrolled before him a parchment sealed with the seal of Brittany. "Tell me the tenor of this parchment," said Gilles de Rais with dignity. "Our good sire of Brittany enjoins you, my lord, by these presents, to follow me to the good town of Nantes, there to clear yourself of certain criminal charges brought against you." "I will follow immediately, my friend, glad to obey the will of my lord of Brittany. But that it may not be said that the Seigneur de Rais has received a message without largesse, I order my treasure, Henriet, to hand over to you and your followers 20 gold crowns. Grand merci, Monseigneur. I pray God that he may give you good and long life. Pray God only to have mercy upon me, and to pardon my sins." The Marshal had his horses saddled, and left Machecoul with Pontou and Henriet, who had thrown in their lot with him. It was with lively emotion that the people in the villages traversed by the little troop saw the redoubted Gilles de Laval ride through the streets, surrounded by soldiers in the livery of the Duke of Brittany, and unaccompanied by a single soldier of his own. The roads and streets were thronged. Peasants left the field, women their kitchens. Labourers deserted their cattle at the plough to throng the road to Nantes. The cavalcade proceeded in silence. The very crowd which had gathered to see it was hushed. Presently a shrill woman's voice was raised. "My child! Restore my child!" Then a wild, wrathful howl broke from the lips of the throng, rang along the Nantes road, and only died away as the great gates of the Château de Bouffay closed on the prisoner. The whole population of Nantes was in commotion, and it was said that the investigation would be fictitious, that the Duke would screen his kinsman, and that the object of general execration would escape with the surrender of some of his land. And such would probably have been the event of the trial, had not the Bishop of Nantes and the Grand Seneschal taken a very decided course in the matter. They gave the Duke no peace till he had yielded to their demand for a thorough investigation and a public trial. Jean Quinze nominated Jean de Toucheron to collect information, and to take down the charges brought against the Marshal. At the same time he was given to understand that the matter was not to be pressed, and that the charges upon which the Marshal was to be tried were to be softened down as much as possible. The Commissioner, Jean de Toucheron, opened the investigation on the 18th of September, assisted only by his clerk, Jean Thomas. The witnesses were introduced either singly or in groups, if they were relations. On entering, the witness knelt before the Commissioner, kissed the crucifix, and swore with his hand on the Gospel that he would speak the truth and nothing but the truth. After this, he related all the facts referring to the charge, which came under his cognizance, without being interrupted or interrogated. The first to present herself was Perrine Lessard, living at Roche-Bernard. She related, with tears in her eyes, that 2 years ago, in the month of September, the Sire de Rais had passed with all his retinue through La Roche-Bernard, on his way from Vannes, and had lodged with Jean Collin. She lived opposite the house in which the nobleman was staying. Her child, the finest in the village, a lad aged 10, had attracted the notice of Pontou, and perhaps of the Marshal himself, who stood at a window, leaning on his squire's shoulder. Pontou spoke to the child, and asked him whether he would like to be a chorister. The boy replied that his ambition was to be a soldier. "Well then," said the squire, "I will equip you." The lad then laid hold of Pontou's dagger, and expressed his desire to have such a weapon in his belt. Thereupon the mother had run up and had made him leave hold of the dagger, and saying that the boy was doing very well at school and was getting on with his lessons, for he was one day to be a monk. Part2 had dissuaded her from this project, and had proposed to take the child with him to Machecoul and to educate him to be a soldier. Thereupon he paid her down 100 sols to buy the lad a dress, and had obtained permission to carry him off. Next day her own son had been mounted on a horse purchased for him from Jean Collin, and had left the village in the retinue of the Sire de Retz. The poor mother at parting had gone in tears to the marshal, and had entreated him to be kind to her child. From that time she had been able to obtain no information regarding her son. She had watched the Sire de Retz whenever he had passed through Werewolf Bernard, but had never observed her child among his pages. She had questioned several of the marshal's people, but they had laughed at her. The only answer she had obtained was, "Be not afraid, he is either at Machecoul, or else at Tiffauges, or else at Porny, or somewhere." Perrine's story was corroborated by Jean Collin, his wife, and his mother-in-law. Jean Lomagon and his wife, Alain Douly, Perrault Duponnet, Guillaume Villon, Guillaume Portaille, Etienne de Montcard, and Jean Lefebvre, all inhabitants of Saint-Etienne de Montcroux, deposed that the little child, son of Guillaume Brief of the said parish, having lost his father at the age of 9, lived on alms and went round the country begging. The child, named Jamais, had vanished suddenly at midsummer, and nothing was known of what had become of him, but strong suspicions were entertained of his having been carried off by an aged hag who had appeared shortly before in the neighbourhood, and who had vanished along with the child. On the 27th of September, Jean de Toucheron, assisted by Nicolas Chateau, notary of the court of Nantes, received the depositions of several inhabitants of Pont-de-Launay, near Bouvron, to wit, Guillaume Fourage and wife, Jean, wife of Jean Lefebvre, and Ricard, wife of Jean Gandeau. These depositions, though very vague, afforded sufficient cause for suspicion to rest on the marshal. 2 years before, a child of 12, son of Jean Bernard, and another child of the same age, son of Meneguet, had gone to Machecoul. The son of Meneguet had returned alone in the evening, relating that his companion had asked him to wait for him on the road, whilst he begged at the gates of the Sire de Retz. The son of Meneguet said that he had waited 3 hours, but his companion had not returned. The wife of Guillaume Fourage deposed that she had seen the lad at this time with an old hag, who was leading him by the hand towards Machecoul. That same evening this hag passed over the bridge of Launay, and the wife of Fourage asked her what had become of little Bernard. The old woman neither stopped nor answered further than by saying he was well provided for. The boy had not been seen since. On the 28th of September, the Duke of Brittany joined another commissioner, Jean Coupe-Gorge, and a second notary, Michel Estalour, to Toucheron and Chateau. The inhabitants of Machecoul, a little town over which the Sire de Retz exercised supreme power, appeared now to depose against their lord. André Barbier, shoemaker, declared that last Easter a child, son of his neighbour Georges Le Barbier, had disappeared. He was last seen gathering plums behind the Hotel Rondeau. This disappearance surprised none in Machecoul, and no one ventured to comment on it. André and his wife were in daily terror of losing their own child. They had been a pilgrimage to Saint-Jean-d'Angely, and had been asked there whether it was the custom at Machecoul to eat children. On their return they had heard of 2 children having vanished, the son of Jean Gandon and that of Alexandre Chatelier. André Barbier had made some inquiries about the circumstances of their disappearance, and had been advised to hold his tongue, and to shut his ears and eyes, unless he were prepared to be thrown into a dungeon by the lord of Machecoul. But, bless me, he had said, am I to believe that a fairy spirits off and eats our little ones? Believe what you like, was the advice given to him, but ask no questions. As this conversation had taken place, one of the marshal's men-at-arms had passed, when all those who had been speaking took to their heels. André, who had run with the rest, without knowing exactly why he fled, came upon a man near the Church of the Holy Trinity, who was weeping bitterly and crying out, "O my God, wilt thou not restore to me my little one?" This man had also been robbed of his child. Lisette, wife of Guillaume Sargon, living at La Boncardière in the parish of Saint Croix de Machecoul, had lost her son 2 years before, and had not seen him since. She besought the commissioners, with tears in her eyes, to restore him to her. "I left him," said she, "at home whilst I went into the field with my husband to sow flax. He was a bonny little lad, and he was as good as he was bonny. He had to look after his tiny sister, who was 1.5 years old. On my return home, the little girl was found, but she could not tell me what had become of him. Afterwards we found in the marsh a small red woolen cap which had belonged to my poor darling, but it was in vain that we dragged the marsh. Nothing was found more, except good evidence that he had not been drowned. A hawker who sold needles and thread passed through Machecoul at the time, and told me that an old woman in grey, with a black hood on her head, had moments after passed him, leading a little boy by the hand. Georges Le Barbier, living near the gate of the Châtelet de Machecoul, gave an account of the manner in which his son had evanesced. The boy was apprenticed to Jean Pelletier, tailor to Madame de Ray, and to the household of the castle. He seemed to be getting on in his profession, when last year, about St. Barnabas' Day, he went to play at ball on the castle green. He never returned from the games. This youth and his master, Jean Pelletier, had been in the habit of eating and drinking at the castle, and had always laughed at the ominous stories told by the people. Guillaume Hilaire and his wife confirmed the statements of Le Barbier. They also said that they knew of the loss of the sons of Jean Gendron, Jean Rouan, and Alexandre Chatelier. The son of Jean Gendron, aged 12, lived with the said Hilaire and learned of him the trade of skinner. He had been working in the shop for 7 or 8 years, and was a steady, hard-working lad. One day, Messieurs Gilles de Sillé and Roger de Briqueville entered the shop to purchase a pair of hunting gloves. They asked if little Gendron might take a message for them to the castle. Hilaire readily consented, and the boy received beforehand the payment for going, a gold angelus, and he started, promising to be back directly. But he had never returned. That evening, Hilaire and his wife, observing Gilles de Sillé and Roger de Briqueville returning to the castle, ran to them and asked what had become of the apprentice. They replied that they had no notion of where he was, as they had been absent hunting, but that it was possible he might have been sent to Tiffauges, another castle of De Ray. Guillaume Hilaire, whose depositions were more grave and explicit than the others, positively asserted that Jean Dujardin, valet to Roger de Briqueville, had told him he knew of a cask secreted in the castle, full of children's corpses. He said that he had often heard people say that children were enticed to the chateau and then murdered, but had treated it as an idle tale. He said, moreover, that the marshal was not accused of having any hand in the murders, but that his servants were supposed to be guilty. Jean Gendron himself deposed to the loss of his son, and he added that his was not the only child which had vanished mysteriously at Machecoul. He knew of 30 that had disappeared. Jean Chiffolon, elder and junior, Jean Aubin, and Clement Doré, all inhabitants of the parish of Thomage, deposed that they had known a poor man of the same parish, named Mathelin Thomas, who had lost his son, aged 12, and that he had died of grief in consequence. Jean Rouan of Machecoul, who for 9 years had been in a state of uncertainty whether her son were alive or dead, deposed that the child had been carried off whilst keeping sheep. She had thought that he had been devoured of wolves, but 2 women of Machecoul, now deceased, had seen Gilles de Sillé approach the little shepherd, speak to him, and point to the castle. Shortly after, the lad had walked off in that direction. The husband of Jean Rouan went to the chateau to inquire after his son, but could obtain no information. When next Gilles de Silet appeared in the town, the disconsolate mother entreated him to return him, as he had been to the king at Amboise. Jean, widow of Aymeri Hedelon, living at Machecoul, had also lost, 8 years before, a little child as he had pursued some butterflies into the wood. At the same time 4 other children had been carried off, those of Gendron, Roux, and Marseille-Sauron. She said that the story circulated through the country was that Gilles de Silet stole children to make them over to the English ransom of his brother who was a captive. But she added that this report was traced to the servants of Silet, and that it was propagated by them. One of the last children to disappear was that of Noah, that for one child stolen at Machecoul, he received beforehand the payment for going, and repeated the circumstances connected with the loss of the children of Chatelier, and entered the castle with the company of Jean l'Abbé. She had entered a stable. At the bottom of a trough she had found a child's shirt covered with blood. Several inhabitants of the Book of Werewolves, to wit, Perrault, Hilaire and his wife, of Paqueteau, Jean Sorel, Catherine Degripé, Gilles Garnier, Perrine Vieillard, Marguerite Redien, Marie, Jean Laudet, said that they had heard Guillaume Hamelin last Easter lamenting the loss of 2 children. Isabeau, wife of Guillaume Hamelin, confirmed the youngest replied that they had. She heard that another child had been lost, the son of Michaud Bonnel of Saint-Sué-de-Ray. Guillemette, that her son had been carried off whilst guarding cows. Guillaume Rodigo and his wife, living at Bourg-Neuf-en-Ray, deposed that on the eve of La Saint Bartholomew's Day, the Sire de Ray lodged with Guillaume Plumet in his way, and Bernard Lecanino. Their positions were more grave and explicit than the other. Pontou beckoned to him and spoke to him in a low tone. Roger de The servant maid, who saw him go out, called to him that the supper table was not yet cleared, but he paid no attention to what she said. Annoyed at the loss of his servant, asked some of the marshal's men what had become of him. He had to go, adding that Pontou had entered the house and spoken with Bernard. Guillaume Plumet and wife confirmed what Rodigo and Saurin had said. Thomas Acy and wife deposed to the loss of their son aged 10, who had gone to beg at the gate of the castle of meat into the chateau. Jamette, wife of Eustache Drouet of Saint-Leger, had sent 2 sons, one aged 10, the other 7, to the castle, and the servants of the marshal became a hand in the murders, but that suspicion on the inmates of the castle. I will not give the details, for they much resemble those of. Before the commissioners closed the inquiry, a herald of the Duke of Brittany in Tabard blew 3 calls on additional charges to bring against the Sire de Ray to present themselves without delay. That his was not the only child. The commissioners visited the Duke with the information they had collected in their junior, Jean Aubange, and sentenced a kinsman, the most powerful of his vassals, the blood settled in his mind, Thomas, having sinned horribly again and again. Yet have I never have confessed my sins, deploring them heartily, and have received the blood of our Lord at least once in the been in a state of awaiting your honoured justice. I have been overwhelmed with not into what monastery I am sent, but I intend that all my goods, etc., should be distributed among the poor, but 2 women of Machecoul, awaiting your glorious clemency, on which I rely, I pray God our Lord to protect you and your kingdom. He who addressed all earthly humility, Friar Gilles, Carmelite, and to the bishop after the lad had walked off in dukes at the Kested. In the meantime, the bishop and the Grand Seneschal had went next and remains, but a complete examination could not be made, as the Duke was anxious to screen him. If your President of Brittany does not bring the case into secular court by the Judge of heaven and earth, I will cite the tribunal. The resolution of the bishop compelled, in the meantime, a little child as he had pursued some but husband was to and Marseille-Sauron. Of the Book of Werewolves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are here. Please visit the Council of his brother Baring-Gould. Chapter 12. The Marshal. Pierre de l'Hôpital. The Requisition. The trial adjourned. Meeting of the last. Pontou persuaded to confess all. The adjourned trial not hurried on. The hesitation of the Duke of Brittany. On the 10th of October, Nicolas Chateau, Sire de l'Hôpital, President of Brittany, Seneschal of Rennes, and Chief Justice of the Duchy of Brittany. The Sire de Retz, who believed himself all the one of justice, he asked for Pontou and Henriet to impose on his judges. He had around his neck massive chains of gold, had entered the castle with the company of Jean l'Abbé. She had entered a stable, and had found a heap of ashes and powder, which had a sickly and peculiar smell. At the bottom of a trough she had found a child's shirt covered with blood. Several inhabitants of the Bourg of Fresnay, to wit, Perrault, Parqueteau, Jean Solot, Catherine d'Agrippa, Gilles Garnier, Perrine Vieillard, Marguerite Redien, Marie Carfon, Jean Laudet, said that they had heard Guillaume Hamelin last Easter lamenting the loss of 2 children. Isabeau, wife of Guillaume Hamelin, confirmed these depositions, saying that she had lost them 7 years before. She had at that time 4 children. The eldest, aged 15, the youngest, aged 7, went together to Machecoul to buy some bread, but they did not return. She sat out for them all night, and next morning she heard that another child had been lost, the son of Michaud Bonnel of Saint-Sué-de-Ré. Guillemette, wife of Michaud Bonnel, said that her son had been carried off whilst guarding cows. Guillaume Rodigo and his wife, living at Bourg-Neuf-en-Ré, deposed that on the eve of last St. Bartholomew's Day, the Sire de Retz lodged with Guillaume Plumet in his village. Pontou, who accompanied the marshal, saw a lad of 15, named Bernard Lecanino, servant to Rodigo, standing at the door of his house. The lad could not speak much French, but only bas breton. Pontou beckoned to him and spoke to him in a low tone. That evening at 10 o'clock, Bernard left his master's house, Rodigo and his wife being absent. The servant maid, who saw him go out, called to him that the supper table was not yet cleared, but he paid no attention to what she said. Rodigo, annoyed at the loss of his servant, asked some of the marshal's men what had become of him. They replied mockingly that they knew nothing of the little Breton, but that he had probably been sent to Tiffauges to be trained as page to their lord. Marguerite Soren, the chambermaid alluded to above, confirmed the statement of Rodigo, adding that Pontou had entered the house and spoken with Bernard. Guillaume Plumet and wife confirmed what Rodigo and Saurin had said. Thomas Acy and wife deposed to the loss of their son aged 10, who had gone to beg at the gate of the castle of Machecoul, and a little girl had seen him drawn by an offer of meat into the chateau. Jamette, wife of Eustache Drouet of Saint-Leger, had sent 2 sons, one aged 10, the other 7, to the castle to obtain alms. They had not been seen since. On the 2nd of October the commissioners sat again, and the charges became graver, and the servants of the marshal became more and more implicated. The disappearance of 13 other children was substantiated under circumstances throwing strong suspicion on the inmates of the castle. I will not give the details, for they much resemble those of the former depositions. Suffice it to say that before the commissioners closed the inquiry, a herald of the Duke of Brittany in Tabard blew 3 calls on the trumpet from the steps of the Tower of Bouffay, summoning all who had additional charges to bring against the Sire de Retz to present themselves without delay. As no fresh witnesses arrived, the case was considered to be made out, and the commissioners visited the Duke with the information they had collected in their hands. The Duke hesitated long as to the steps he should take. Should he judge and sentence a kinsman, the most powerful of his vassals, the bravest of his captains, a counsellor of the king, a marshal of France? Whilst still unsettled in his mind as to the course he should pursue, he received a letter from Gilles de Retz, which produced quite a different effect from that which it had been intended to produce. Monsieur, my cousin and honoured sire, it is quite true that I am perhaps the most detestable of all sinners, having sinned horribly again and again, yet have I never failed in my religious duties. I have heard many masses, vespers, etc., have fasted in Lent and on vigils, have confessed my sins, deploring them heartily, and have received the blood of our Lord at least once in the year. Since I have been languishing in prison, awaiting your honoured justice, I have been overwhelmed with incomparable repentance for my crimes, which I am ready to acknowledge and to expiate as is suitable. Wherefore I supplicate you, monsieur my cousin, to give me license to retire into a monastery, and there to lead a good and exemplary life. I care not into what monastery I am sent, but I intend that all my goods, etc., should be distributed among the poor, who are the members of Jesus Christ on earth. Awaiting your glorious clemency, on which I rely, I pray God our Lord to protect you and your kingdom. He who addresses you is in all earthly humility, Friar Gilles, Carmelite in intention. The Duke read this letter to Pierre de l'Hôpital, President of Brittany, and to the Bishop of Nantes, who were those most resolute in pressing on the trial. They were horrified at the tone of this dreadful communication, and assured the Duke that the case was so clear, and the steps taken had been so decided, that it was impossible for him to allow De Retz to escape trial by such an impious device as he suggested. In the meantime, the Bishop and the Grand Seneschal had set on foot an investigation at the castle of Machecoul, and had found numerous traces of human remains, but a complete examination could not be made, as the Duke was anxious to screen his kinsman, as much as possible, and refused to authorize one. The Duke now summoned his principal officers and held a council with them. They unanimously sided with the Bishop and de l'Hôpital, and when John still hesitated, the Bishop of Nantes rose and said, Monseigneur, this case is one for the Church as much as for your court to take up. Consequently, if your President of Brittany does not bring the case into secular court by the Judge of heaven and earth, I will cite the author of these execrable crimes to appear before our ecclesiastical tribunal. The resolution of the Bishop compelled the Duke to yield, and it was decided that the trial should take its course without let or hindrance. In the meantime, the unhappy wife of Gilles de Retz, who had been separated from him for some while, and who loathed his crimes, though she still felt for him as her husband, hurried to the Duke with her daughter, to entreat pardon for the wretched man. But the Duke refused to hear her. Thereupon she went to Amboise to intercede with the king for him who had once been his close friend and adviser. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of the Book of Werewolves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. The Book of Werewolves by Sabine Baring-Gould. Chapter 12. The Marechal de Retz. 2. The Trial. The appearance of the Marshal, Pierre de l'Hôpital. The requisition, the trial adjourned. Meeting of the Marshal and his servants. The confession of Henri. Part2 persuaded to confess all. The adjourned trial not hurried on. The hesitation of the Duke of Brittany. On the 10th of October, Nicolas Chateau, notary of the Duke, went to the Chateau of Bouffay to read to the prisoner the summons to appear in person on the morrow before Monsieur de l'Hôpital, President of Britain, Seneschal of Rome, and Chief Justice of the Duchy of Britain. The Sire de Retz, who believed himself already a novice in the Carmelite order, had dressed in white and was engaged in singing litanies. When the summons had been read, he ordered a page to give the notary wine and cake, and then he returned to his prayers with every appearance of compunction and piety. On the morrow, Jean l'Abbé and 4 soldiers conducted him to the Hall of Justice. He asked for Part2 and Henri to accompany him, but this was not permitted. He was adorned with all his military insignia, as though to impose on his judges. He had around his neck massive chains of gold, and several collars of knightly orders. His costume, with the exception of his purpoint, was white, in token of his repentance. His purpoint was of pearl-grey silk, studded with gold stars, and girded around his waist by a scarlet belt, from which dangled a poignard in scarlet velvet sheath. His collar cuffs and the edging of his purpoint were of white ermine. His little round cap or chapeau was white, surrounded with a belt of ermine, a fur which only the great feudal lords of Brittany had a right to wear. All the rest of his dress, to his shoes, which were long and pointed, was white. No one at first glance would have thought the Sire de Retz to be by nature so cruel and vicious as he was supposed to be. On the contrary, his physiognomy was calm and phlegmatic, somewhat pale, and expressive and melancholy. His hair and moustache were light brown, and his beard was clipped to a point. This beard, which resembled no other beard, was black, but under certain lights it assumed a blue hue, and it was this peculiarity which obtained for the Sire de Retz the surname of Bluebeard, a name which has attached to him in popular romance, at the same time that his story has undergone strange metamorphosis. But on closer examination of the countenance of Gilles de Retz, contraction in the muscles of his face, nervous quivering of the mouth, spasmodic twitchings of the brows, and above all the sinister expression of the eyes, showed that there was something strange and frightful in the man. At intervals he ground his teeth, like a wild beast preparing to dash upon his prey, and then his lips became so contracted as they were drawn in and glued, as it were, to his teeth, that their very colour was indiscernible. At times also his eyes became fixed, and the pupils dilated to such an extent, with a sombre fire quivering in them, that the iris seemed to fill the whole orbit, which became circular and sank back into the head. At these moments his complexion became livid and cadaverous. His brow, especially just over the nose, was covered with deep wrinkles, and his beard appeared to bristle and to assume its bluish hues. But after a few moments his features became again serene, with a sweet smile reposing upon them, and his expression relaxed into a vague and tender melancholy. "Messire," said he, saluting his judges, "I pray you to expedite my matter, and dispatch as speedily as possible my unfortunate case, for I am peculiarly anxious to consecrate myself to the service of God, who has pardoned my great sins. I shall not fail, I assure you, to endow several of the churches in Nantes, and I shall distribute the greater portion of my goods among the poor, to secure the salvation of my soul." "Monseigneur," replied gravely Pierre de l'Hôpital, "it is always well to think of the salvation of one's soul, but, if you please, think now that we are concerned with the salvation of your body." "I have confessed to the Father Superior of the Carmelites," replied the Marshal with tranquillity, "and through his absolution I have been able to communicate. I am therefore guiltless and purified. Men's justice is not in common with that of God, Monseigneur, and I cannot tell you what will be your sentence. Be ready to make your defence, and listen to the charges brought against you, which Monsieur le Lieutenant du Procureur de Nantes will read." The officer rose, and read the following paper of charges, which I shall condense. Having heard the bitter complaints of several of the inhabitants of the diocese of Nantes, whose names follow hereinafter, here follow the names of the parents of the lost children, we, Philippe de Livron, Lieutenant Assesseur of Messire le Procureur de Nantes, have invited, and do invite, the very noble and very wise Messire Pierre de l'Hôpital, President of Brittany, etc., to bring to trial the very high and very powerful Lord Gilles de Laval, Sire de Retz, Machecoul, England, and other places, Counsellor of His Majesty the King, and Marshal of France, forasmuch as the said Sire de Retz has seized and caused to be seized several little children, not only 10 or 20, but 30, 40, 60, 100, 200 and more, and has murdered and slain them inhumanely, and burnt their bodies to convert them to ashes. Forasmuch as persevering in evil, the said Sire, notwithstanding that the powers that be are ordained of God, and that every one should be an obedient subject of his prince, has assaulted Jean le Ferron, subject of the Duke of Brittany, the said Jean le Ferron being guardian of the fortress of Malamore, in the name of Geoffrey le Ferron, his brother, to whom the said lord has made over the possession of the said place, forasmuch as the said sire forced Jean Leferron to give up to him the said place, and moreover retook the lordship of Malamore in despite of the order of the dukes and of justice, forasmuch as the said sire arrested Master Jean Rousseau, sergeant of the duke, who was sent to him with injunctions from the said duke, and beat his men with their own staves, although their persons were under the protection of his grace. We conclude that the said Sire de Retz, homicide in fact and in intent according to the first count, rebel and felon according to the second, should be condemned to suffer corporal punishment, and to pay a fine of his possessions in lands and goods held in fief to the said nobleman, and that these should be confiscated and remitted to the crown of Brittany. This requisition was evidently drawn up with the view of saving the life of the Sire de Retz, for the crime of homicide was presented without aggravating circumstances, in such a manner that it could be denied or shelved, whilst the crimes of felony and rebellion against the Duke of Brittany were brought into exaggerated prominence. Gilles de Retz had undoubtedly been forewarned of the course which was to be pursued, and he was prepared to deny totally the charges made in the first count. Monseigneur, said Pierre de l'Hôpital, whom the form of the requisition had visibly astonished, what justification have you to make? Take an oath on the Gospels to declare the truth. No, monsieur, answered the marshal. The witnesses are bound to declare what they know upon oath, but the accused is never put on his oath. Quite so, replied the judge, because the accused may be put on the rack and constrained to speak the truth, and please you. Gilles de Retz turned pale, bit his lips, and cast a glance of malignant hate at Pierre de l'Hôpital. Then, composing his countenance, he spoke with an appearance of calm. Messieurs, I shall not deny that I behaved wrongfully in the case of Jean Rousseau, but, in excuse, let me say that the said Rousseau was full of wine, and he behaved with such indecorum towards me in the presence of my servants, that it was quite intolerable. Nor will I deny my revenge on the brothers Leferron. Jean had declared that the said Grace of Brittany had confiscated my fortress of Malamore, which I had sold to him, and for which I have not yet received payment, and Geoffrey Leferron had announced far and wide that I was about to be expelled Brittany as a traitor and a rebel. To punish them, I re-entered my fortress of Malamore. As for the other charges, I shall say nothing about them. They are simply false and calumnious. Indeed, exclaimed Pierre de l'Hôpital, whose blood boiled with indignation against the wretch who stood before him with such effrontery. All these witnesses who complain of having lost their children lied under oath. Undoubtedly, if they accuse me of having anything to do with their loss, what am I to know about them? Am I their keeper? The answer of Cain, exclaimed Pierre de l'Hôpital, rising from his seat in the vehemence of his emotion. However, as you solemnly deny these charges, we must question Henriet and Pontou. Henriet? Pontou? Cried the marshal, trembling. They accuse me of nothing, surely. Not as yet. They have not been questioned, but they are about to be brought into court, and I do not expect that they will lie in the face of justice. I demand that my servants be not brought forward as witnesses against their master, said the marshal, his eyes dilating, his brow wrinkling, and his beard bristling blue upon his chin. A master is above the gossiping tales and charges of his servants. Do you think, then, monsieur, that your servants will accuse you? I demand that I, a marshal of France, a baron of the duchy, should be sheltered from the slanders of small folk, whom I disown as my servants if they are untrue to their master. Messieurs, I see we must put you on the rack, or nothing will be got from you. Hola! I appeal to his grace the Duke of Brittany, and ask an adjournment, that I may take advice on the charges brought against me, which I have denied, and which I deny still. Well, I shall adjourn the case to the 25th of this month, that you may be well prepared to meet the accusations. On his way back to prison, the marshal passed Henriet and Pontou as they were being conducted to the court. Henriet pretended not to see his master, but Pontou burst into tears on meeting him. The marshal held out his hand, and Pontou kissed it affectionately. Remember what I have done for you. and be faithful servants, said Gilles de Rais. Henriet recoiled from him with a shudder, and the Marshal passed on. I shall speak, whispered Henriet, for we have another master besides our poor master of Rais, and we shall soon be with the heavenly one. The President ordered the clerk to read again the requisition of the lieutenant, that the two presumed accomplices of Gilles de Rais might be informed of the charges brought against their master. Henriet burst into tears, trembled violently, and cried out that he would tell all. Pontou, alarmed, tried to hinder his companion, and said that Henriet was touched in the head, and that what he was about to say would be the ravings of insanity. Silence was imposed upon him. I will speak out, continued Henriet, and yet I dare not speak of the horrors which I know have taken place before that image of my Lord Christ. And he pointed tremblingly to a large crucifix above the seat of the judge. Henriet, moaned Pontou, squeezing his hand, you will destroy yourself as well as your master. Pierre de l'Hôpital rose, and the figure of our Redeemer was solemnly veiled. Henriet, who had great difficulty in overcoming his agitation, then began his revelation. The following is the substance of them. On leaving the University of Angers, he had taken the situation of reader in the house of Gilles de Rais. The Marshal took a liking to him, and made him his chamberlain and confidant. On the occasion of the Sire de la Suze, brother of the Sire de Rais, taking possession of the castle of Chantonce, Charles de Soenne, who had arrived at Chantonce, assured Henriet that he had found in the oubliettes of a tower a number of dead children, some headless, others frightfully mutilated. Henriet then thought that this was but a calumny invented by the Sire de la Suze. But when, some while after, the Sire de Rais retook the castle of Chantonce, and had ceded it to the Duke of Brittany, he one evening summoned Henriet, Pontou, and a certain Petit Robin to his room. The two latter were already deep in the secrets of their master, but before confiding anything to Henriet, de Rais made him take a solemn oath never to reveal what he was about to tell him. The oath taken, the Sire de Rais, addressing the three, said that on the morrow an officer of the Duke would take possession of the castle in the name of the Duke, and that it was necessary, before this took place, that a certain well should be emptied of children's corpses, and that their bodies should be put into boxes and transported to Machecoul. Henriet, Pontou, and Petit Robin went together, furnished with ropes and hooks, to the tower where were the corpses. They toiled all night in removing the half-decayed bodies, and with them they filled 3 large cases, which they sent by a boat down the Loire to Machecoul, where they were reduced to ashes. Henriet counted 36 children's heads, but there were more bodies than heads. This night's work, he said, had produced a profound impression on his imagination, and he was constantly haunted with the vision of these heads rolling as in a game of skittles, and clashing with a mournful wail. Henriet soon began to collect children for his master, and was present whilst he massacred them. They were murdered invariably in one room at Machecoul. The Marshal used to bathe in their blood. He was fond of making Gilles de Sille, Pontou of Henriet, torture them, and he experienced intense pleasure in seeing them in their agony. But his great passion was to welter in their blood. His servants would stab a child in the jugular vein, and let the blood squirt over him. The room was often steeped in blood. When the horrible deed was done, and the child was dead, the Marshal would be filled with grief for what he had done, and would toss weeping and praying on a bed, or recite fervent prayers and litanies on his knees, whilst his servants washed the floor, and burned in the huge fireplace the bodies of the murdered children. With the bodies were burned the clothes and everything that had belonged to the little victims. An insupportable odour filled the room, but the Maréchal de Rais inhaled it with delight. Henriet acknowledged that he had seen 40 children put to death in this manner, and he was able to give an account of several, so that it was possible to identify them with the children reported to be lost. It is quite impossible, said the lieutenant, who had been given the cue to do all that was possible to save the Marshal. It is impossible that the bodies could be burned in a chamber fireplace. It was done for all that, monsieur, replied Henriet. The fireplace was very large, both at the Hotel Suze and also at Machecoul. We piled up great faggots and logs and laid the dead children among them. In a few hours the operation was complete, and we flung the ashes out of the window into the moat. Henriet remembered the case of the 2 sons of Amelon. He said that, whilst the one child was being tortured, the other was on its knees sobbing and praying to God till its own turn came. "What you have said concerning the excesses of the Sire de Retz," exclaimed the lieutenant du procureur, "seems to be pure invention, and destitute of all probability. The greatest monsters of iniquity never committed such crimes, except perhaps some Caesars of old Rome. Messire, it was the acts of these Caesars that my Lord of Retz desired to imitate. I used to read to him the chronicles of Suetonius and Tacitus, in which their cruelties are recorded. He used to delight in hearing of them, and he said that it gave him greater pleasure to hack off a child's head than to assist at a banquet. Sometimes he would seat himself on the breast of a little one, and with a knife sever the head from the body at a single blow. Sometimes he cut the throat half through very gently, that the child might languish, and he would wash his hands and his beard in its blood. Sometimes he had all the limbs chopped off at once from the trunk. At other times he ordered us to hang the infants till they were nearly dead, and then take them down and cut their throats. I remember having walked to him 3 little girls who were asking charity at the castle gates. He bade me cut their throats, whilst he looked on. André Briquet found another little girl crying on the steps of the house at Mons, because she had lost her mother. He brought the little thing, it was but a babe, in his arms to my lord, and it was killed before him. Pontou and I had to make away with the body. We threw it down a privy in one of the towers, but the corpse caught on a nail in the outer wall, so that it would be visible to all who passed. Pontou was let down by a rope, and he disengaged it with great difficulty. How many children do you estimate that the Sire de Retz and his servants have killed? The reckoning is long. I, for my part, confess to having killed 12 with my own hand, by my master's orders, and I have brought him about 60. I knew that things of the kind went on before I was admitted to the secret, for the castle of Machecoul had been occupied a short while by the Sire de la Sage. My lord recovered it speedily, for he knew that there were many children's corpses hidden in a hayloft. There were 40 there, quite dry and black as coal, because they had been charred. One of the women of Madame de Retz came by chance into the loft and saw the corpses. Roger de Briqueville wanted to kill her, but the Maréchal would not let him. Have you nothing more to declare? Nothing. I asked Pontou, my friend, to corroborate what I have said. This deposition, so circumstantial and detailed, produced on the judges a profound impression of horror. Human imagination at this time had not penetrated such mysteries of refined cruelty. Several times, as Henriet spake, the President had shown his astonishment and indignation by signing himself with the cross. Several times his face had become scarlet, and his eyes had fallen. He had pressed his hand to his brow to assure himself that he was not labouring under a hideous dream, and a quiver of horror had run through his whole frame. Pontou had taken no part in the revelation of Henriet, but when the latter appealed to him, he raised his head, looked sadly round the court, and sighed. Etienne Cornilon, alias Pontou, I command you in the name of God and justice to declare what you know. This injunction of Pierre de l'Hôpital remained unresponded to, and Pontou seemed to strengthen himself in his resolution not to accuse his master. But Henriet, flinging himself into the arms of his accomplice, implored him, as he valued his soul, no longer to harden his heart to the calls of God, but to bring to light the crime he had committed along with the Sire de Retz. The lieutenant du procureur, who hitherto had endeavoured to extenuate or discredit the charges brought against Gilles de Retz, tried a last expedient to counterbalance the damaging confession of Henriet, and to withhold Pontou from giving way. You have heard, Monseigneur, said he to the President, the atrocities which have been acknowledged by Henriet, and you, as I do, consider them to be pure inventions of the aforesaid, made out of bitter hatred and envy, with the purpose of ruining his master. I therefore demand that Henriet should be put to the rack, that he may be brought to give the lie to his former statement." "You forget," replied de l'Hôpital, "that the rack is for those who do not confess, and not for those who freely acknowledge their crimes. Therefore I order the second accused, Etienne Cornillon, alias Pontou, to be placed on the rack if he continues silent. Pontou, will you speak, or will you not?" "Monseigneur, he will speak," exclaimed Henriet. "O Pontou, dear friend, resist not God any more." "Well then, Monseigneur," said Pontou with emotion, "I will satisfy you. I cannot defend my poor lord against the allegations of Henriet, who has confessed all through dread of eternal damnation." He then fully substantiated all the statements of the other, adding other facts of the same character known only to himself. Notwithstanding the avowal of Pontou and Henriet, the adjourned trial was not hurried on. It would have been easy to have captured some of the accomplices of the wretched man, but the Duke, who was informed of the whole of the proceedings, did not wish to augment the scandal by increasing the number of the accused. He even forbade researches to be made into the castles and mansions of the Sire de Retz, fearing lest proofs of fresh crimes, more mysterious and more horrible than those already divulged, should come to light. The dismay spread through the country by the revelations already made demanded that religion and morality, which had been so grossly outraged, should be speedily avenged. People wondered at the delay in pronouncing sentence, and it was loudly proclaimed in Nantes that the Sire de Retz was rich enough to purchase his life. It is true that Madame de Retz solicited the king and the duke again to give pardon to her husband, but the duke, counselled by the bishop, refused to extend his authority to interfere with the course of justice, and the king, after having sent one of his counsellors to Nantes to investigate the case, determined not to stir in it. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of the Book of Werewolves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. The Book of Werewolves by Sabine Baring-Gould. Chapter 13. Maréchal de Retz, the Sentence and Execution. The adjourned trial. The Marshal confesses. The case handed over to the ecclesiastical tribunal. Prompt step taken by the bishop. The sentence. Ratified by the secular court. The execution. On the 24th of October, the trial of the Maréchal de Retz was resumed. The prisoner entered in a Carmelite habit, knelt and prayed in silence before the examination began. Then he ran his eye over the court, and the sight of the rack, windlass, and cords made a slight shudder run through him. "Messire Gilles de Laval," began the president, "you appear before me now for the second time to answer to a certain requisition read by Monsieur le Lieutenant du Procureur de Nantes." "I shall answer frankly, Monseigneur," said the prisoner calmly, "but I reserve the right of appeal to the benign intervention of the very venerated Majesty of the King of France, of whom I am, or have been, Chamberlain and Marshal, as may be proved by my letters patent duly enregistered in the Parliament of Paris." "This is no affair of the King of France," interrupted Pierre de l'Hôpital. "If you are Chamberlain and Marshal of His Majesty, you are also vassal of His Grace the Duke of Brittany. I do not deny it, but, on the contrary, I trust to His Grace of Brittany to allow me to retire to a convent of Carmelites, there to repent me of my sin. That is as may be. Will you confess, or must I send you to the rack?" "Torture me not," exclaimed Gilles de Retz. "I will confess all. Tell me first, what have Henriet and Pontou said?" "They have confessed. Monsieur le Lieutenant du Procureur shall read you their allegations." "Not so," said the lieutenant, who continued to show favour to the accused. "I pronounce them false, unless Monsieur de Retz confirms them by oath, which God forbid." Pierre de l'Hopital made a motion of anger to check this scandalous pleading in favour of the accused, and then nodded to the clerk to read the evidence. The Sire de Retz, on hearing that his servants had made such explicit avowals of their acts, remained motionless, as though thunderstruck. He saw that it was in vain for him to equivocate, and that he would have to confess all. "What have you to say?" asked the President, when the confessions of Henriet and part2 had been read. "Say what befits you, my lord," interrupted the lieutenant de procureur, as though to indicate to the accused the line he was to take. "Are not these abominable lies and calumnies trumped up to ruin you?" "Alas, no," replied the Sire de Retz, and his face was pale as death. "Henriet and part2 have spoken the truth. God has loosened their tongues. My lord, relieve yourself of the burden of your crimes by acknowledging them at once," said Monsieur de l'Hopital earnestly. "Messire," said the prisoner, after a moment's silence, "it is quite true that I have robbed mothers of their little ones, and that I have killed their children, or caused them to be killed, either by cutting their throats with daggers or knives, or by chopping off their heads with cleavers, or else I have had their skulls broken by hammers or sticks. Sometimes I had their limbs hewn off one after another. At other times I have ripped them open, that I might examine their entrails and hearts. I have occasionally strangled them or put them to a slow death, and when the children were dead, I had their bodies burned and reduced to ashes." "When did you begin your execrable practices?" asked Pierre de l'Hopital, staggered by the frankness of these horrible avowals. "The evil one must have possessed you." "It came to me from myself, no doubt at the instigation of the devil. But still, these acts of cruelty afforded me incomparable delight. The desire to commit these atrocities came upon me 8 years ago. I left court to go to Champcenetz, that I might claim the property of my grandfather, deceased. In the library of the castle I found a Latin book, Suetonius I believe, full of accounts of the cruelties of the Roman emperors. I read the charming history of Tiberius, Caracalla, and other Caesars, and the pleasure they took in watching the agonies of tortured children. Thereupon I resolved to imitate and surpass these same Caesars, and that very night I began to do so. For some while I confided my secret to no one, but afterwards I communicated it to my cousin, Gilles de Philippe, then to Master Roger de Villefort, next in succession Henriet, part2, Rossignol, and Robin. He then confirmed all the accounts given by his 2 servants. He confessed to about 120 murders in a single year." "An average of 800 in less than 7 years?" exclaimed Pierre de l'Hopital with a cry of pain. "Ah, messire, you were possessed!" His confession was too explicit and circumstantial for the lieutenant de procureur to say another word in his defence, but he pleaded that the case should be made over to the ecclesiastical court, as there were confessions of invocations of the devil and of witchcraft mixed up with those of murder. Pierre de l'Hopital saw that the object of the lieutenant was to gain time for Madame de Retz to make a fresh attempt to obtain a pardon. However, he was unable to resist, so he consented that the case should be transferred to the bishop's court. But the bishop was not a man to let the matter slip, and there and then a sergeant of the bishop summoned Gilles de Laval, Sire de Retz, to appear forthwith before the ecclesiastical tribunal. The marshal was staggered by this unexpected citation, and he did not think of appealing against it to the president. He merely signed his readiness to follow, and he was at once conducted into the ecclesiastical court assembled hurriedly to try him. This new trial lasted only a few hours. The marshal, now thoroughly cowed, made no attempt to defend himself, but he endeavoured to bribe the bishop into leniency by promise of the surrender of all his lands and goods to the church, and begged to be allowed to retire into the Carmelite monastery at night. His request was peremptorily refused, and sentence of death was pronounced against him. On the 25th of October, the ecclesiastical court having pronounced judgment, the sentence was transmitted to the secular court, which had now no pretext upon which to withhold ratification. There was some hesitation as to the kind of death the marshal was to suffer. the members of the secular tribunal were not unanimous on their point. The president put it to the vote, and collected the votes himself. Then he reseated himself, covered his head, and said in a solemn voice, "The court, notwithstanding the quality, dignity, and nobility of the accused, condemns him to be hung and burned. Wherefore I admonish you who are condemned to ask pardon of God and grace to die well, in great contrition for having committed the said crimes. And the said sentence shall be carried into execution tomorrow morning between 11 and 12 o'clock." A similar sentence was pronounced upon Henriet and Pontou. On the morrow, October the 26th, at 9 o'clock in the morning, a general procession composed of half the people of Nantes, the clergy and the bishop bearing the Blessed Sacrament, left the cathedral and went round the city visiting each of the principal churches, where masses were said for the three under sentence. At 11 the prisoners were conducted to the place of execution, which was in the meadow of Biette, on the further side of the Loire. 3 gibbets had been erected, one higher than the other, and beneath each was a pile of faggots, tar, and brushwood. It was a glorious, breezy day. Not a cloud was to be seen in the blue heavens. The Loire rolled silently towards the sea, its mighty volumes of turbid water seeming bright and blue as it reflected the brilliancy and colour of the sky. The poplars shivered and whitened in the fresh air with a pleasant rustle, and the willows flickered and wavered above the stream. A vast crowd had assembled round the gallows. It was with difficulty that a way was made for the condemned, who came on chanting the De Profundis. The spectators of all ages took up the psalm and chanted it with them, so that the surge of the old Gregorian tone might have been heard by the Duke and the Bishop, who had shut themselves up in the chateau of Nantes during the hour of execution. After the close of the psalm, which was terminated by the Requiem Aeternam instead of the Gloria, the Sire de Retz thanked those who had conducted him, and then embraced Pontou and Henriet, before delivering himself of the following address, or rather sermon. "My very dear friends and servants, be strong and courageous against the assault of the devil, and feel great displeasure and contrition for your ill deeds, without despairing of God's mercy. Believe with me that there is no sin, however great, in the world, which God in his grace and loving kindness will not pardon when one asks it of him with contrition of heart. Remember that the Lord God is always ready to receive the sinner, then is the sinner to ask of him pardon. Moreover, let us very humbly thank him for his great love to us in letting us die in full possession of our faculties, and not cutting us off suddenly in the midst of our misdeeds. Let us conceive such a love of God and such repentance, that we shall not fear death, which is only a little pang, without which we could not see God in his glory. Besides, we must desire to be freed from this world, in which is only misery, that we may go to everlasting glory. Let us rejoice rather, for although we have sinned grievously here below, yet we shall be united in paradise, our souls being parted from our body, and we shall be together for ever and ever, if only we endure in our pious and honourable contrition to our last sigh." Then the marshal, who was to be executed first, left his companions and placed himself in the hands of his executioners. He took off his cap, knelt, kissed the crucifix, and made a pious oration to the crowd much in the style of his address to his friends Pontou and Henriet. Then he commenced reciting the prayers of the dying. The executioner passed the cord round his neck and adjusted the knot. He mounted a tall stool, erected at the foot of the gallows, as a last honour paid to the nobility of the criminals. The pile of firewood was lighted before the executioners had left him. Pontou and Henriet, who were still on their knees, raised their eyes to their master and cried to him, extending their arms, "At this last hour, Monseigneur, be a good and valiant soldier of God, and remember the passion of Jesus Christ which wrought our redemption. Farewell. We hope soon to meet in paradise." The stool was cast down, and the Sire de Retz dropped. The fire roared up, the flames leapt about him and enveloped him as he swung. Suddenly, mingling with the deep booming of the cathedral bell, swelled up the wild unearthly wail of the Dies Irae. No sound among the crowd, only the growl of the fire, and the solemn strain of the hymn. Lo, the book, exactly worded, wherein all hath been recorded, thence shall judgment be awarded. When the judge his seat attaineth, and each hidden deed arraigneth, nothing unavenged remaineth. What shall I, frail man, be pleading? Who for me be interceding, when the just are mercy needing? King of majesty tremendous, who dost free salvation send us, fount of pity, then befriend us. Lo, I kneel with heart submission. See, like ashes, my contrition. Help me in my last condition. Ah, that day of tears and mourning, I from the dust of earth returning, man for judgment must prepare him. Spare, O God, in mercy spare him. Lord, who didst our souls redeem, grant a blessed requiem. 6 women veiled and robed in white, and 6 Carmelites advanced, bearing a coffin. It was whispered that one of the veiled women was Madame de Rey, and that the others were members of the most illustrious houses of Brittany. The cord by which the marshal was hung was cut, and he fell into a cradle of iron prepared to receive the corpse. The body was removed before the fire had gained any mastery over it. It was placed in the coffin, and the monks and the women transported it to the Carmelite monastery of Nantes, according to the wishes of the deceased. In the meantime, the sentence had been executed upon Pontou and Henriet. They were hung and burned to dust. Their ashes were cast to the winds, whilst in the Carmelite Church of Our Lady were celebrated with pomp the obsequies of the very high, very powerful, very illustrious Seigneur Gilles de Laval, Sire de Rey, late Chamberlain of King Charles VII, and Marshal of France. End of chapter 13.
Chapter 14 of the Book of Werewolves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Book of Werewolves by Sabine Baring-Gould. Chapter 14. A Galician Werewolf. The inhabitants of Austrian Galicia. The hamlet of Polomia. Summer evening in the forest. The beggar Swiatek. A girl disappears. A schoolboy vanishes. A servant girl lost. Another boy carried off. The discovery made by the publican of Polomia. Swiatek locked up. Brought to Dobkov. Commits suicide. The inhabitants of Austrian Galicia are quiet, inoffensive people, take them as a whole. The Jews, who number 1/12 of the population, are the most intelligent, energetic, and certainly the most money-making individuals in the province, though the Poles proper, or Mazurs, are not devoid of natural parts. Perhaps as remarkable a phenomenon as any other in that kingdom, for kingdom of Valdemir it was, is the enormous numerical preponderance of the nobility over the untitled. In 1837, the proportions stood thus: 32,190 nobles to 2,076 tradesmen. The average of execution for crime is 9 a year, out of a population of 4.5 millions, by no means a high figure, considering the peremptory way in which justice is dealt forth in that province. Yet, in the most quiet and well-disposed neighborhoods, occasionally the most startling atrocities are committed, occurring when least expected, and sometimes perpetrated by the very person who is least suspected. Just 16 years ago there happened in the circle of Tornov, in western Galicia, the province is divided into 9 circles, a circumstance which will probably furnish the grandames with a story for their firesides, during their bitter Galician winters, for many a long year. In the circle of Tornov, in the lordship of Parkost, is a little hamlet called Polomia, consisting of 8 hovels and a Jewish tavern. The inhabitants are mostly woodcutters, hewing down the firs of the dense forest in which their village is situated, and conveying them to the nearest water, down which they are floated to the Vistula. Each tenant pays no rent for his cottage and patch of field, but is bound to work a fixed number of days for his landlord, a practice universal in Galicia, and often productive of much discontent and injustice, as the proprietor exacts labor from his tenant on those days when the harvest has to be got in, or the land is in best condition for tillage, and just when the peasant would gladly be engaged upon his own small plot. Money is scarce in the province, and this is accordingly the only way in which the landlord can be sure of his dues. Most of the villagers of Polomyja are miserably poor, but by cultivating a little maize and keeping a few fowls or a pig, they scrape together sufficient to sustain life. During the summer the men collect resin from the pines, from each of which, once in 12 years, they strip a slip of bark, leaving the resin to exude and trickle into a small earthenware jar at its roots, and during the winter, as already stated, they fell the trees and roll them down to the river. Polomyja is not a cheerful spot, nested among dense masses of pine, which shed a gloom over the little hamlet. Yet on a fine day it is pleasant enough for the old women to sit at their cottage doors, scenting that matchless pine fragrance, sweeter than the balm of the Spice Islands, for there is nothing cloying in that exquisite and exhilarating odor, listening to the harp-like thrill of the breeze in the old grey tree-tops, and knitting quietly at long stockings, whilst their little grandchildren romp in the heather and tufted fern. Towards evening, too, there is something indescribably beautiful in the fir-wood. The sun dives among the trees, and paints their boles with patches of luminous saffron, or falling over a level clearing, glorifies it with its orange dye, so visibly contrasting with the blue-purple shadow on the western rim of unreclaimed forest, deep and luscious as the bloom on a plum. The birds, then, are hastening to their nests. A gerfalcon, high overhead, is kindled with sunlight. Capering and gambolling among the branches, the merry squirrel skips home for the night. The sun goes down, but the sky is still shining with twilight. The wild cat begins to hiss and squall in the forest, the heron to flap hastily by, the stork on the top of the tavern chimney to poise itself on one leg for sleep. Too! An owl begins to wake up. Hark! The woodcutters are coming home with a song. Such is Polomyja in summertime, and much resembling it are the hamlets scattered about the forest at intervals of a few miles, in each the public house being the most commodious and best-built edifice, the church, whenever there is one, not remarkable for anything but its bulbous steeple. You would hardly believe that amidst all this poverty a beggar could have picked up any subsistence, and yet, a few years ago, Sunday after Sunday, there sat a white-bearded venerable man at the church door, asking alms. Poor people are proverbially compassionate and liberal, so that the old man generally got a few coppers, and often some good woman bade him come into her cottage and let him have some food. Occasionally Swiatek, that was the beggar's name, went his rounds selling small pinchbeck ornaments and beads, generally, however, only appealing to charity. One Sunday, after church, a Mazur and his wife invited the old man into their hut and gave him a crust of pie and some meat. There were several children about, but a little girl of 9 or 10 attracted the old man's attention by her artless tricks. Swiatek felt in his pocket and produced a ring, enclosing a piece of colored glass set over foil. This he presented to the child, who ran off delighted to show her acquisition to her companions. "Is that little maid your daughter?" asked the beggar. "No," answered the housewife. "She is an orphan. There was a widow in this place who died, leaving the child, and I have taken charge of her. One mouth more will not matter much, and the good God will bless us." "Aye, aye, to be sure he will. The orphans and fatherless are under his own peculiar care." "She's a good little thing, and gives no trouble," observed the woman. "You go back to Polomyja tonight, I reckon." "I do." "Ah!" exclaimed Swiatek, as the little girl ran up to him. "You like the ring? Is it not beautiful? I found it under a big fir to the left of the churchyard. There may be dozens there. You must turn round 3 times, bow to the moon, and say, 'Zaboy.' Then look among the tree roots till you find one." "Come along," screamed the child to its comrades. "We will go and look for rings." "You must seek separately," said Swiatek. The children scampered off into the wood. "I have done one good thing for you," laughed the beggar, "in ridding you for a time of the noise of those children." "I am glad of a little quiet now and then," said the woman. "The children will not let the baby sleep at times with their clatter. Are you going?" "Yes, I must reach Polomyja tonight. I am old and very feeble and poor." He began to fall into his customary whine. "Very poor, but I thank and pray to God for you." Swiatek left the cottage. That little orphan was never seen again. The Austrian government has, of late years, been vigorously advancing education among the lower orders, and establishing schools throughout the province. The children were returning from class one day, and were scattered among the trees, some pursuing a field mouse, others collecting juniper berries, and some sauntering with their hands in their pockets, whistling. "Where's Peter?" asked one little boy of another who was beside him. "We three go home the same way. Let us go together." "Peter!" shouted the lad. "Here I am," was the answer from among the trees. "I'll be with you directly." "Oh, I see him," said the elder boy. There was someone talking to him. "Where?" "Yonder, among the pines." "Ah, they have gone further into the shadow, and I cannot see them any more. I wonder who was with him. A man, I think." The boys waited till they were tired, and then they sauntered home, determined to thrash Peter for having kept them waiting. But Peter was never seen again. Sometime after this, a servant girl, belonging to a small store kept by a Russian, disappeared from a village 5 miles from Polomyja. She had been sent with a parcel of grocery to a cottage at no very great distance, but lying apart from the main cluster of hovels, and surrounded by trees. The day closed in, and her master waited her return anxiously. But as several hours elapsed without any sign of her, he, assisted by the neighbors, went in search of her. A slight powdering of snow covered the ground, and her footsteps could be traced at intervals where she had diverged from the beaten track. In that part of the road where the trees were thickest, there were marks of 2 pair of feet leaving the path. But owing to the density of the trees at that spot, and to the slightness of the fall of snow, which did not reach the soil, where shaded by the pines, the footsteps were immediately lost. By the following morning a heavy fall had obliterated any further traces which daylight might have discovered. The servant girl, also, was never seen again. During the winter of 1849, the wolves were supposed to have been particularly ravenous, for thus alone did people account for the mysterious disappearances of children. A little boy had been sent to a fountain to fetch water. The pitcher was found standing by the well, but the boy had vanished. The villagers turned out, and those wolves which could be found were dispatched. We have already introduced our readers to Polomyja, although the occurrences above related did not take place among those 8 hovels, but in neighboring villages. The reason for our having given a more detailed account of this cluster of houses, rude cabins they were, will now become apparent. In May 1849, the innkeeper of Polomyja missed a couple of ducks, and his suspicions fell upon the beggar who lived there, and whom he held in no esteem, as he himself was a hard-working, industrious man, whilst Swiatek maintained himself, his wife, and children by mendicity, although possessed of sufficient arable land to yield an excellent crop of maize and produce vegetables if tilled with ordinary care. As the publican approached the cottage, a fragrant whiff of roast greeted his nostrils. "I'll catch the fellow in the act," said the innkeeper to himself, stealing up to the door, and taking good care not to be observed. As he threw open the door, he saw the mendicant hurriedly shuffle something under his feet, and conceal it beneath his long clothes. The publican was on him in an instant, had him by the throat, charged him with theft, and dragged him from his seat. Judge of his sickening horror when from beneath the pauper's clothes rolled forth the head of a girl about the age of 14 or 15 years, carefully separated from the trunk. In a short while the neighbors came up. The venerable Swiatek was locked up, along with his wife, his daughter, a girl of 16, and a son, aged 5. The hut was thoroughly examined, and the mutilated remains of the poor girl discovered. In a vat were found the legs and thighs, partly raw, partly stewed or roasted. In a chest were the heart, liver, and entrails, all prepared and cleaned, as neatly as though done by a skillful butcher, and finally, under the oven was a bowl full of fresh blood. On his way to the magistrate of the district, the wretched man flung himself repeatedly on the ground, struggled with his guards, and endeavored to suffocate himself by gulping down clods of earth and stones, but was prevented by his conductors. When taken before the protocol at Dabkov, he stated that he had already killed and, assisted by his family, eaten 6 persons. His children, however, asserted most positively that the number was much greater than he had represented, and their testimony is borne out by the fact that the remains of 14 different caps and suits of clothes, male as well as female, were found in his house. The origin of this horrible and depraved taste was as follows, according to Swiatek's own confession. In 1846, 3 years previous, a Jewish tavern in the neighborhood had been burned down, and the host had himself perished in the flames. Swiatek, whilst examining the ruins, had found a half-roasted corpse of the publican among the charred rafters of the house. At that time the old man was craving with hunger, having been destitute of food for some time. The scent and the sight of the roasted flesh inspired him with an uncontrollable desire to taste of it. He tore off a portion of the carcass and satiated his hunger upon it, and at the same time he conceived such a liking for it that he could feel no rest till he had tasted again. His second victim was the orphan above alluded to. Since then, that is, during the period of no less than 3 years, he had frequently subsisted in the same manner, and had actually grown sleek and fat upon his frightful meals. The excitement roused by the discovery of these atrocities was intense. Several poor mothers who had bewailed the loss of their little ones felt their wounds reopened agonizingly. Popular indignation rose to the highest pitch. There was some fear lest the criminal should be torn in pieces himself by the enraged people as soon as he was brought to trial, but he saved the necessity of precautions being taken to ensure his safety, for on the first night of his confinement he hanged himself from the bars of the prison window. End of chapter 14.
Chapter 15 of the Book of Werewolves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Martine van Hapelen, Amsterdam. The Book of Werewolves by Sabine Baring-Gould. Chapter 15. Anomalous Case, the Human Hyena. Ghouls. Story from Fornari. Quotation from Apuleius. Incident mentioned by Marcassus. Cemeteries of Paris violated. Discovery of violator. Confession of Monsieur Bertrand. It is well known that Oriental romance is full of stories of violators of graves. Eastern superstition attributes to certain individuals a passion for unearthing corpses and mangling them. Of a moonlight night, weird forms are seen stealing among the tombs and burrowing into them with their long nails, desiring to reach the bodies of the dead ere the first streak of dawn compels them to retire. These ghouls, as they are called, are supposed generally to require the flesh of the dead for incantations or magical compositions, but very often they are actuated by the sole desire of rending the sleeping corpse and disturbing its repose. There is every probability that these ghouls were no mere creations of the imagination, but were actual resurrectionists. Human fat and the hair of a corpse which has grown in the grave form ingredients in many a necromantic recipe, and the witches who compounded these diabolical mixtures would unearth corpses in order to obtain the requisite ingredients. It was the same in the Middle Ages, and to such an extent did the fear of ghouls extend, that it was common in Brittany for churchyards to be provided with lamps, kept burning during the night, that witches might be deterred from venturing under cover of darkness to open the graves. Fornari gives the following story of a ghoul in his History of Sorcerers. In the beginning of the 15th century, there lived at Baghdad an aged merchant who had grown wealthy in his business, and who had an only son, to whom he was tenderly attached. he resolved to marry him to the daughter of another merchant, a girl of considerable fortune, but without any personal attractions. Abul Hassan, the merchant's son, on being shown the portrait of the lady, requested his father to delay the marriage till he could reconcile his mind to it. Instead, however, of doing this, he fell in love with another girl, the daughter of a sage, and he gave his father no peace till he consented to the marriage with the object of his affections. The old man stood out as long as he could, but finding that his son was bent on acquiring the hand of the fair Nadila, and was equally resolute not to accept a rich and ugly lady, he did what most fathers under such circumstances are constrained to do. He acquiesced. The wedding took place with great pomp and ceremony, and a happy honeymoon ensued, which might have been happier but for one little circumstance, which led to very serious consequences. Abul Hassan noticed that his bride quitted the nuptial couch as soon as she thought her husband was asleep, and did not return to it till an hour before dawn. Filled with curiosity, Hassan one night feigned sleep, and saw his wife rise and leave the room as usual. He followed cautiously, and saw her enter a cemetery. By the straggling moonbeams he beheld her go into a tomb. He stepped in after her. The scene within was horrible. A party of ghouls were assembled with the spoils of the graves they had violated, and were feasting on the flesh of the long-buried corpses. His own wife, who, by the way, never touched supper at home, played no inconsiderable part in the hideous banquet. As soon as he could safely escape, Abul Hassan stole back to his bed. He said nothing to his bride till next evening, when supper was laid, and she declined to eat. Then he insisted on her partaking, and when she positively refused, he exclaimed wrathfully, "Yes, you keep your appetite for your feasts with the ghouls." Nadila was silent. She turned pale and trembled, and without a word sought her bed. At midnight she rose, fell on her husband with her nails and teeth, tore his throat, and having opened a vein, attempted to suck his blood. But Abul Hassan, springing to his feet, threw her down, and with a blow killed her. She was buried next day. 3 days after, at midnight, she reappeared, attacked her husband again, and again attempted to suck his blood. He fled from her, and on the morrow opened her tomb, burned her to ashes, and cast them into the Tigris. This story connects the ghoul with the vampire. As will be seen by a former chapter, the werewolf and the vampire are closely related. That the ancients held the same belief that the witches violate corpses is evident from the 3rd episode in the Golden Ass of Apuleius. I will only quote the words of the crier. "I pray thee, tell me," replied I, "of what kind are the duties attached to this funeral guardianship?" "Duties?" quoth the crier. "Why, keep wide awake all night, with thine eyes fixed steadily upon the corpse, neither winking nor blinking, nor looking to the right, nor looking to the left, either to one side or the other, be it even little. For the witches, infamous wretches that they are, can slip out of their skins in an instant, and change themselves into the form of any animal they have a mind, and then they crawl along so slyly that the eyes of justice, nay, the eyes of the sun himself, are not keen enough to perceive them. At all events, their wicked devices are infinite in number and variety, and whether it be in the shape of a bird, or a dog, or a mouse, or even of a common housefly, that they exercise their dire incantations, if thou art not vigilant in the extreme, they will deceive thee one way or the other, and overwhelm thee with sleep. Nevertheless, as regards the reward, it will be from 4 to 6 aurei, nor, although 'tis a perilous service, wilt thou receive more. Nay, hold! I had almost forgotten to give thee a necessary caution. Clearly understand that if the corpse be not restored to their relatives entire, the deficient pieces of flesh, torn off by the teeth of the witches, must be replaced from the face of the sleepy guardian. Here we have the rending of corpses connected with change of form. Marquesas relates that after a long war in Syria, during the night, troops of Lamias, female evil spirits, appeared upon the field of battle, unearthing the hastily buried corpses of the soldiers, and devouring the flesh of their bones. They were pursued and fired upon, and some young men succeeded in killing a considerable number. But during the day they had all of them the forms of wolves or hyenas. That there is a foundation of truth in these horrible stories, and that it is quite possible for a human being to be possessed of a depraved appetite for rending corpses, is proved by an extraordinary case brought before a court-martial in Paris so late as July 10, 1849. The details are given with fullness in the Annales Médico-Psychologiques for that month and year. They are too revolting for reproduction. I will, however, give an outline of this remarkable case. In the autumn of 1848, several of the cemeteries in the neighborhood of Paris were found to have been entered during the night, and the graves to have been rifled. The deeds were not those of medical students, for the bodies had not been carried off, but were found lying about the tombs in fragments. It was at first supposed that the perpetration of these outrages must have been a wild beast, but footprints in the soft earth left no doubt that it was a man. Close watch was kept at Père Lachaise, but after a few corpses had been mangled there, the outrages ceased. In the winter another cemetery was ravaged, and it was not till March 1849 that a spring gun which had been set in the cemetery of Saint-Parnasse went off during the night and warned the guardians of the place that a mysterious visitor had fallen into their trap. They rushed to the spot, only to see a dark figure in a military mantle leap the wall and disappear in the gloom. Marks of blood, however, gave evidence that he had been hit by the gun when it had discharged. At the same time, a fragment of blue cloth torn from the mantle was obtained, and afforded a clue towards the identification of the ravisher of the tombs. On the following day, the police went from barrack to barrack, inquiring whether officer or man was suffering from a gunshot wound. By this means they discovered the person. He was a junior officer in the 1st Infantry Regiment of the name of Bertrand. He was taken to the hospital to be cured of his wound, and on his recovery he was tried by court-martial. His history was this. He had been educated in the theological seminary of Langres, till, at the age of 20, he entered the army. He was a young man of retiring habits, frank and cheerful to his comrades, so as to be greatly beloved by them, of feminine delicacy and refinement, and subject to fits of depression and melancholy. In February 1847, as he was walking with a friend in the country, he came to a churchyard, the gate of which stood open. The day before, a woman had been buried, but the sexton had not completed filling in the grave, and he had been engaged upon it on the present occasion, when a storm of rain had driven him to shelter. Bertrand noticed the spade and pick lying beside the grave, and, to use his own words, « À cette vue des idées noires me vinrent. J'eus comme un violent mal de tête. Mon cœur battait avec force. Je ne me possédais plus. » He managed by some excuse to get rid of his companion, and then, returning to the churchyard, he caught up a spade and began to dig into the grave. Soon I dragged the corpse out of the earth and began to hash it with the spade, without well knowing what I was about. A labourer saw me, and I laid myself flat on the ground till he was out of sight, and then I cast the body back into the grave. I then went away, bathed in cold sweat, to a little grove, where I reposed for several hours, notwithstanding the cold rain which fell, in a condition of complete exhaustion. When I rose, my limbs were as if broken, and my head weak. The same prostration and sensation followed each attack. 2 days after, I returned to the cemetery, and opened the grave with my hands. My hands bled, but I did not feel the pain. I tore the corpse to shreds, and flung it back into the pit. He had no further attack for 4 months, till his regiment came to Paris. As he was one day walking in the gloomy, shadowy alleys of Père Lachaise, the same feeling came over him like a flood. In the night he climbed a wall, and dug up a little girl of 7 years old. He tore her in half. A few days later he opened the grave of a woman who had died in childbirth, and had lain in the grave for 13 days. On the 16th of November he dug up an old woman of 50, and, ripping her to pieces, rolled among the fragments. He did the same to another corpse on the 12th of December. These are only a few of the numerous cases of violation of tombs to which he owned. It was on the night of the 15th of March that the spring gun shot him. Bertrand declared at his trial that whilst he was in the hospital he had not felt any desire to renew his attempts, and that he considered himself cured of his horrible propensities, for he had seen men dying in the beds around him, and now, je suis guéri, car aujourd'hui j'ai peur de mort. The fits of exhaustion which followed his excesses are very remarkable, as they precisely resemble those which followed the berserker rages of the Northmen, and the expeditions of the lycanthropists. The case of Monsieur Bertrand is indubitably most singular and anomalous. It scarcely bears the character of insanity, but seems to point rather to a species of diabolical possession. At first, the excesses chiefly followed upon his drinking wine, but after a while they came upon him without exciting cause. The manner in which he mutilated the dead was different. Some he chopped with a spade, others he tore and ripped with his teeth and nails. Sometimes he tore the mouth open and rent the face back to the ears. He opened the stomachs and pulled off the limbs. Although he dug up the bodies of several men, he felt no inclination to mutilate them, whereas he was delighted in rending female corpses. He was sentenced to a year's imprisonment. End of chapter 15. Recording by Martine van Havelen, Amsterdam.
Chapter 16 of the Book of Werewolves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Karen Spence. The Book of Werewolves by Sabine Baring-Gould. Chapter 16. A Sermon on Werewolves. The following curious specimen of a late medieval sermon is taken from the old German edition of the Discourses of Dr. Johann Deiler von Kaisersberg, a famous preacher in Strasbourg. The volume is entitled Die Ameisen. Dies ist das Buch von der Ameisen. Undrückt der König ich gern, und sagt von Eigenschaft der Ameisen, gibt Unterweisung von der unholden Erdehexen, und von Gespenst, der Geist, und von dem wütenden Hirwunderwale. This strange series of sermons was preached at Strasbourg in the year 1508, and was taken down and written out by a barefooted friar, Johann Pauli, and by him published in 1517. The doctor died on Midland Sunday, 1510. There is a Latin edition of his sermons, but whether of the same series or not I cannot tell, as I have been unable to obtain a sight of the volume. The German edition is illustrated with bold and clever woodcuts. Among other, there are representations of the witch's Sabbath, the wild huntsman, and a werewolf attacking a man. The sermon was preached on the third Sunday in Lent. No text is given, but there is a general reference to the Gospel for the day. This is the discourse. What shall we say about werewolves? For there are werewolves which run about the villages, devouring men and children. As men say about them, they run about at full gallop, injuring men, and are called Werewolf or Werewolf. Do you ask me if I know aught of them? I answer yes. They are apparently wolves which eat men and children, and that happens on 7 accounts: Isurium, hunger; Rabium, savageness; Snectum, old age; Experientium, experience; Insanium, madness; Diabolum, the devil; and Deum, God. The first happens through hunger. When the wolves find nothing to eat in the woods, they must come to people and eat men when hunger drives them to it. You see well, when it is very cold, that the stags come in search of food up to the villages, and the birds actually into the dining room in search of victuals. Under the second head, wolves eat children through their innate savageness. Because they are savage, and that is, propter locum coitum ferum, their savageness arises first from their condition. Wolves which live in cold places are smaller on that account, and more savage than other wolves. Secondly, their savageness depends on the season. They are more savage about Candlemas than at any other time of the year, and men must be more on their guard against them then than at other times. It is a proverb, "He who seeks a wolf at Candlemas, a peasant on Shrove Tuesday, and a parson in Lent, is a man of pluck." Thirdly, their savageness depends on their having young. When the wolves have young, they are more savage than when they have not. We see it in all beasts. A wild duck, when it has young poults, you see what an uproar it makes. A cat fights for its young kittens, and wolves do ditto. Under the third head, the wolves do injury on account of their age. When a wolf is old, it is weak and feeble in its legs, so it can't run fast enough to catch stags, and therefore it rends a man, whom it can catch easier than a wild animal. It also tears children and men easier than wild animals because of its teeth, for its teeth break off when they are very old. You see it well in old women, how the last teeth wobble, and they have scarcely a tooth left in their heads, and they open their mouths for men to feed them with mash and stewed substances. Under the fourth head, the injury the werewolves do arises from experience. It is said that human flesh is far sweeter than other flesh, so when a wolf has once tasted human flesh, he desires to taste it again. So he acts like old topers, who, when they know the best wine, will not be put off with inferior quality. Under the fifth head, the injury arises from ignorance. A dog, when it is mad, is also inconsiderate, and it bites any man. It does not recognize its own lord. And what is a wolf but a wild dog, which is mad and inconsiderate, so that it regards no man? Under the sixth head, the injury comes of the devil, who transforms himself and takes on him the form of a wolf. So writes Vincentus in his Speculum Historium, and he has taken it from Valerius Maximus in the Punic War. When the Romans fought against the men of Africa, when the captain lay asleep, there came a wolf and drew his sword, and carried it off. That was the devil in a wolf's form. The like writes William of Paris that a wolf will kill and devour children and do the greatest mischief. There was a man who had the fantasy that he himself was a wolf, and afterwards he was found lying in the wood, and he was dead out of sheer hunger. Under the seventh head, the injury comes of God's ordinance. For God will sometimes punish certain lands and villages with wolves. So we read of Elijah, that when Elijah wanted to go up a mountain and out of Jericho, some naughty boys made a mock of him and said, "O bald head, step up! O glossy pate, step up!" What happened? He cursed them. Then came 2 bears out of the desert and tore about 42 of the children. That was God's ordinance. The like we read of a prophet, who would set at naught the commands he had received of God, and he was persuaded to eat bread at the house of another. As he went home, he rode upon his ass. Then came a lion which slew him, and left the ass alone. That was God's ordinance. Therefore must a man turn to God when he brings wild beasts to do him a mischief, which same brutes may he not bring now or evermore. Amen. It will be seen from this extraordinary sermon that Dr. Johann Geiler von Kaiserswerth did not regard werewolves with any other light than natural wolves filled with the lust for human flesh, and he puts aside altogether the view that they are men in a state of metamorphosis. However, he alludes to this superstition in his sermon on the wild men of the woods, but translates his lycanthropist to Spain. End of chapter 16. Recording by Karen Spence. End of the Book of Werewolves by Sabine Baring-Gould.
Every story leaves a trace, some in history, others in the shadows. If this one made you think, question, or shiver just a little, you're in the right place. This is Truth Meets Fiction. Until next time, stay curious, stay sharp, and don't believe everything you're told. Every story leaves a trace, some in history, others in the shadows. If this one made you think, question, or shiver just a little, you're in the right place. This is Truth Meets Fiction. Until next time, stay curious, stay sharp, and don't believe everything you're told.